Right now, as this story is presented to you, Allied airmen are in the skies over Europe, hitting again and again at the heart of the enemy's staggering war machine. I'm confident that we will be ready and that we have the strength and the determination to strike the final knockout blow.
That women play no active part in war is a perception that has existed down the centuries. But there is another story, a powerful story of women being very actively involved in the war of words and pictures. Both in the factual reporting and the depiction of war. And their cousin, propaganda. Women have played a very positive role in changing the way warfare is viewed by those not on the battlefield, through literature and art, through photography, and more recently through the world I know well, that of journalism. Stories about strong and colourful women are handed down and frequently adapted by following generations to suit themselves. Two female fighters, Boadicea and Joan of Arc, have seen their contribution on the battlefield eclipsed by the myths that grew around them and were then used in centuries of propaganda. For Joan of Arc in 15th century France, her success in rallying the French against the English was spread by word of mouth, and she became first a heroine, then a martyr. 4 centuries later, the French turned her into a symbol, an icon for the resistance movement in the First World War, and very effective propaganda. Closer to home, this heroic statue of Boadicea, just outside the Houses of Parliament in London, shows a wild romantic figure, fearless in pursuit, presumably of the Imperial Romans. It was commissioned during the reign of Queen Victoria, when it symbolised Britain's imperial conquests rather than anything achieved by the Icenian warrior queen. And it also came to represent resistance to invasion in the Second World War.
The popular idea of Boudica going into battle in a scythe chariot with her daughters in the chariot with her is, I'm afraid, just a popular idea. British chariots were not like the sort of large chariot that we see at the statue of Boudica in London. They were fairly small wickerwork chariots which took warriors into battle, dropped them off, and then came back and collected them when they needed. Certainly Boudica seems to have had a chariot on the battlefield. Our historical accounts talk about her moving across the battlefield and addressing her troops from the chariot. Whether she actually fought in the battle or just commanded the troops from the rear, we just don't know. I think we're fascinated by Boudica partly because she was a woman who led a revolt against Rome. For the Victorians who put up the statue of Boudica, she represents resistance to a foreign invasion, nobility, the warrior spirit. But in a way that's slightly ironic, because at the time that the statue was put up, Britain herself was being a very imperialistic nature, doing to other countries exactly what the Romans were doing to Britain.
While it might have served short-term propaganda needs to turn great historical figures like Joan of Arc and Boadicea into icons that can be used to support the cause of the day, that process tends to misrepresent them as people, as well as distorting the history around them. Emily Young is a sculptress working on a commission for the Imperial War Museum's Women at War exhibition. She's trying to portray a mythical warrior, the Greek goddess Athene, as honestly as possible, devoid of fanciful additional propaganda.
I was asked to do a piece for the Imperial War Museum's Women in War exhibition, and along the lines of a woman warrior, and who came to mind immediately was Athene. She was a great warrior. She's almost always seen with her helmet on, because she's out there doing battle. At the same time, she was the goddess of justice. She would make the rules. She established Athenian justice system, which we still use today. So she's a good example of a woman warrior.
The myth of Athene is all about her warrior attributes. She's supposed to have sprung fully armed from the forehead of her father Zeus, ruler of the gods. It was Athene he trusted with the keys to his thunderbolts, and she rescued Heracles, Perseus, and Odysseus when they were in danger. But for her sculpture, Emily Young has tried to focus on the essential Athene, producing a simple but distinctive work of art.
She's going to be in a rather dark place, set back in a recess, and so you're coming through darkness and you just see her sort of glowing a bit in this recess. And she's meant to look like something you're not quite sure what you're looking at. It could be very, very old. And I like that sense that, in fact, women in war is a very, very, very old subject. It's been going on since the dawn of mankind. I mean, and, you know, before.
If Boadicea is supposed to epitomise the British or English fighting spirit, then the image that has been most useful to France as a propaganda device in recent history has been the enduring image of Joan of Arc, the country virgin who took her orders from God to lead an army against the English in 1429.
Joan really has two stories. She has the story that happens in that year of her military experience. Then she has the story of the many centuries that have happened since. There's a really interesting letter that goes out by the Duke of Bedford, who's the head of the English troops in France, where he says, you know, if we ever lose this war, meaning the 100 Years' War, we can really give this credit to Joan of Arc. And he sends that to the young Henry VI at the time. That kind of gives me an indication that, you know, certainly there's some propaganda going on. Once she dies, a whole propaganda changes as far as Joan of Arc is concerned. She becomes this heroine. Continues down into the 19th and 20th century. After the loss of the Franco-Prussian War, France was in terrible straits as far as their military was concerned. All of a sudden, statues of Joan of Arc appear all over France.
The adoption of Joan of Arc as propaganda symbol is all the more significant because in the French Revolution, a woman warrior, Marianne, carrying the cap of liberty, was the powerful image of unity and strength. But when the enemy again became a foreign one, Joan re-emerged as the major propaganda tool.
She's been called upon by the French repeatedly when they want their country defended. During World War I, there were posters of Joan of Arc plastering France, or at least the part of France that hadn't been overtaken by collaboration with the Nazis. She was the one calling them to arms, Joan of Arc, because you have this notion of a kind of sacred republic, and that served their purposes better than the symbol of insurrection. Marianne, during the French Revolution, somehow this more sacral figure worked. And the church, of course, thought better of it in the aftermath, and she was canonized. She became a saint.
Joan of Arc was canonised in 1920, centuries after her death. But her story belongs to a time when the church was the only form of mass communication. Propaganda took on new and different forms. Modern warfare also demanded large-scale recruitment and the means to supply this increase in manpower. Here, women would play key roles. So how was the British government in the early 1900s to stir nationalist passions and create a mood of national purpose in the absence of today's sophisticated media? The early 1900s were the golden age of English music hall, and some of the country's best-known entertainers lost no time in doing their bit to fire up their audiences and help the recruitment drive. One of them became something of a recruitment mascot. She was Vesta Tilley, the darling of the music halls. Tilley was a male impersonator who played to packed houses across the country.
She dressed up as various different types of men. The young man, the dandy, and also the soldier. And it was as a soldier that she was felt to aid recruitment in the First World War.
Find the military men who's really worthy of the name, who's ever behind a hand when duty's to be done.
Although she wasn't an agent of the government, Vesta's show was incredibly valuable in aiding the war effort. Her characters were carefully observed and struck a chord with the audience. Songs and lyrics like "Jolly good luck to the girl who loves a soldier" and "I joined the army yesterday, so the army of today is all right" were funny, appealed to men and women alike, and made joining up seem the acceptable and attractive thing to do.
She was popular with men and women. She was popular with men, perhaps because she reflected back to them how they were. She was popular with women because she did all those things soldiers were renowned for doing, but from the stage, it was safe, it wasn't lewd, it was respectable, it was funny.
Lord Kitchener's "Your Country Needs You" posters were direct government propaganda. But Vesta Tilley's songs turned joining up from a duty into an opportunity for heroism. Men listened to her sing that she didn't want to lose them, but she thought they ought to go.
I see the army simply perfect, can't be beat. I know it's true, because I do.
One man who was encouraged by Tilley's stirring performance was Percy Eckersley. His wife Kitty recalled the experience.
Vesta Tilley was on stage. But what we didn't know until we got there was that also on stage were army officers with table all set out for recruiting. She introduced those songs, "We don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go," and "Rule Britannia," and all those kind of things. Then she came off stage and walked all around the audience, up and down, either sides, down the middle. And the young men were getting up and following her. When she got to our row, she hesitated a bit. I don't quite know what happened, but she put her hand on my husband's shoulder. He was on the end seat, and as the men were all following, he got up too. When we got home that night, I was terribly upset. I told him I didn't want him to go and be a soldier. I didn't want to lose him. But he said, "We have to go."
Kitty's husband died at the Battle of Lewes. Away from the excitement of the music hall, women were involved in far less jovial methods of persuading men to join up. The Order of the White Feather was founded in August 1914, and women handed white feathers to men who were not in uniform, to shame them. It was a vicious and spiteful campaign that reached a peak in 1915, but continued sporadically for the remainder of the war. The Order of the White Feather was quite controversial in the way that it challenged men to go into uniform in order to be a man. The fervour could sometimes be misplaced, and there were reports of ugly scenes when women mistakenly gave out feathers to soldiers either on leave or convalescing from wounds from the front. But not all men were intimidated. The satirical writer of the time, Compton Mackenzie, wrote that idiotic young women were using the white feather to rid themselves of boyfriends of whom they were tired, while the peace lobbyist Fenner Brockway boasted that he'd collected enough feathers to make a fan. The relationship between women and the war was further complicated by the fact that World War I coincided with the growth of the suffrage movement, in which women lobbied hard to be given the vote in this country. Some women joined together under Mrs. Pankhurst, and for the first time they had a formal public voice. But with the outbreak of war, their momentum was partly impeded, as it became clear that although they spoke with one voice on the issue of suffrage, on the question of the war, opinion was divided. Emmeline and her daughter Christabel addressed pro-war rallies, whereas the younger daughter, Sylvia, became increasingly pacifist. So, somewhat ironically, a group that had set out to oppose the government on one issue found itself becoming part of the bigger propaganda machine on another.
When war breaks out, there's actually 53 different suffrage organisations in the United Kingdom, so predictably they react in very, very different ways. A small group work through a body called the United Suffragists, which was formed just before the war to try and keep the suffrage flag flying. And they're increasingly joined by dissident suffragettes and suffragists from other organisations as the war continues. Another group of suffrage campaigners go wholeheartedly into the war effort from a recruitment point of view and tour around the country, led by Mrs. Pankhurst of the Women's Social and Political Union, drumming up support, trying to get women to sign up and do war work. Some suffragettes take this further, especially suffragettes who've been involved in the militant campaign to begin with. And they take the opportunity to set up almost paramilitary organisations, the Women's Emergency Corps, the Home Service Corps in Liverpool, where they wear uniforms and drill and say that they're on active service as well as doing voluntary work whilst wearing their uniforms. The final group kind of take that view to extremes and go very, very strongly into the pacifist movement and actually draw on discourses of feminism to argue that because women would never wage war, women actually have a female responsibility to stop war and to stop war internationally.
But when the Second World War broke out in 1939 and a German invasion of Britain became a real threat, there was a brief official endorsement that women should resist by force. In the information film, Mrs. Grant Goes to the Door, women were shown carrying guns and also, of course, outwitting the wily Hun.
The enemy have already bombed Langthorpe Aerodrome. I was on my way there, but I got lost. I wonder if one of you would be good enough to put me on the right road.
Why, of course.
I have your map. An ordnance map, for instance.
Oh, I think I could put my hand on one, but owing to the defence regulations, we keep it under lock and key.
Thank you very much. Once I can find my way to Jarvis Cross, I shall be all right.
Where did you say, Lieutenant? Jarvis Cross?
Yes, that's the place, Jarvis Cross.
You mean Jarvis Cross? Put your hands up. Go on. Carrie, what are you doing? Edith, go to the police station. Tell them we've a German spy here.
Although the credit, therefore, would seem to go to the women, the end of the short is very interesting because the local defence volunteers pick up this German soldier and at the end, the local defence volunteer praises the women for having kept their heads, but the credit really goes to him for having caught this German, and he gets the portion of jam, he gets the rations of sugar and so on in his tea. So there's a curious mixture in that between informing women and showing women being very capable and then taking back the credit and placing it onto a very virile, handsome young man who has ultimately saved the day.
It was stirring stuff. But at the same time as these rather theatrical images of women were being seen on British cinema screens, other women were looking for different ways of engaging with the war as painters, photographers and journalists. World War II showed that even if women were not allowed to fight at the front, many wanted to record such scenes, but were prevented by officialdom. Doris Zinkhuisen had a successful career as a set designer and worked on many prominent productions. Having worked as a volunteer in London for the St. John Ambulance, Zinkhuisen was commissioned to paint scenes of the Red Cross at work in Belgium, France and Germany, only at the very end of the war.
Doris Zinkhuisen was an artist who was commissioned in 1941 by the War Artists Advisory Commission to paint fairly kind of standard scenes of the Women's Royal Naval Service going about their business. And then she, towards the end of the war, she joined the Red Cross, and she was one of the first people to enter Belsen in April 1945. And the scenes that faced her when she went into the camp, I think, must have stuck with her very vividly in her mind. The painting that she did, called Belsen 1945, of sprawling, emaciated bodies just left in piles beneath the trees, is a very shocking, very harrowing one, and one which I think kind of conveys the sense of bitterness that must have faced her and others who spent time with the victims and sadly the dead in those first weeks after the camp was liberated. The painting itself has a very haunting quality. The expressions on the faces of the dead, the way in which their bodies are shown, just thrown, the colours, the whole composition is kind of redolent of the horror that people faced at the end of the war. Mixed with the kind of joy of liberation was the fact that throughout Germany these various camps were being discovered, and the horror that was the Nazi regime was coming to light. So the painting was painted at a very interesting time.
Such haunting images are now part of the collection at the Imperial War Museum in London. And in 1982, they commissioned the artist Linda Kitson to travel to the Falklands when the British fought the Argentinians for control of the islands. How did she approach the task?
I am not a person who is actually interested in war, but at that time it seemed to me that it was perhaps one of the greatest things you could do is to actually, I hope this won't sound old-fashioned, but serve your country. I drew everything that happened around me. There were men working on the runway because it was always being bombed, and they had to roll out this extraordinary sort of matting. I drew for too long. Didn't look at the thermometer, and my watch was so buried underneath the 5 layers of whatever. You can't actually feel the pencil because you've got such an enormous amount of stuff. Rather like when you've had too many drinks. It isn't until you come up for air you realise you've overdone it.
With the conflict exploding around her and with no certainty of victory, how would the tired and stressed soldiers react to this woman in their midst? A non-combatant doing a non-essential job in a life-threatening situation. Would they treat her like a fellow soldier or leave her to her own devices while they got on with the fighting?
I did fall down and faint. And these clucking men, you know, if I'd been on my own, I'd have fallen down and fainted and they wouldn't have known anything about it because everyone was all together. They bundled me off to this hospital and damn the hypothermia, that was nothing. That was where I remember saying, I didn't bring my wash bag. And the medics were wonderful. They said, you want a wash bag? Come and look in this room. And it was filled literally up to my eyes in dead people's wash bags. By this time I was so admiring and partisan, started off in hostility, turned right around. I had a letter from Ronald Searle, who was a war artist in the last World War and still alive in France, and he said, "Your book gave me the feeling of exactly what it was like to be there. I wanted to be maybe someone who could pass knowledge on."
And pass it on she did. To the massive video and stills from the front line were added more intimate and reflective images. A photo captures a second, while a drawing can capture an hour, a personality, a string of events. In the midst of war, a moment of silent calm.
It was really to show people what it was like to be there, who were 8,000 miles away, and I didn't know how strange it would be. And what is weird, I was the first woman artist, and maybe the last one to be in something so tin pot. By tin pot, don't get me wrong, I mean so ad hoc, ad-libbed, basic, brutal, and savage against climate and a dangerous enemy.
Both Doris Zinkhuizen and Linda Kitson lived to tell the tale of their bid to get beneath the official line and convey a more true story of war. The artist Felicia Brown was less fortunate. She was to make her most indelible mark when she paid the ultimate price as the first British volunteer to die in the fight against Franco. Friends of her family still remember the artist come volunteer.
She was a great friend of my grandfather's when he was at university at Cambridge in the 30s, and the drawings we have are drawings that she sent back to him from Spain at the time. She originally went to Spain to paint, but she was actually quite conscious of what was going on in the political situation, to the extent that famously she took self-defense lessons from a small recorded as being rather a diminutive Chinese gentleman in Harley Street. So she would go and do Chinese self-defense because she knew that she fully intended to get involved in the conflict. This really wasn't for the faint-hearted. This involved guns, bombs, sabotage. I think if you wanted a comparison, it'd be a bit like joining the French resistance during the Nazi occupation. One image was made before she left England to join the Spanish militia of a man in Shoreditch with a naphtha lamp, which is a kind of lamp used during power cuts and bombing in the East End of London. And the second drawing is typical of the drawings that she sent back from Spain. She made a lot of works on whatever material she could find, brown paper, bits of canvas, the back of books, sketchbooks, and posted them back to friends. And they're drawings really of typical working Spanish farmers, Spanish peasants, and also, very importantly, Spanish communists, trade union leaders, Spanish rebels, the left-wing soldiers, and people like herself who joined the militia.
Felicia was one of 2,000 or so volunteers who went to Spain from Britain. The men fought at the front, but the Republican leadership began to discourage women from doing so. They felt that pictures of women fighting portrayed the wrong image for their cause. But this change of heart came too late for Felicia Brown. As one of the first volunteers to make for the front, she was involved in heavy fighting, and she was shot outside the town of Saragossa on the 25th of August 1936. She was 34.
She actually travelled with the militia to Aragon in southern Spain, where they were trying to intercept a train loaded with fascist weapons. And during the sortie, she was trying to help her colleague, a militiaman, escape from fascist fire, and she was actually shot and killed. She became a sort of figurehead of a sort of martyr to the cause, if you like, as a woman, as an artist, and also as a fighter, and became very, very well known for the fact that she was killed.
War painting is a tradition going back over centuries of conflict, and it continues to this day. But the development of more mobile and sophisticated stills cameras enhanced the reportage in World War II and gave women, as well as men, greater opportunities to communicate their own visions of war. One woman in particular blazed a trail, an American. She was recording her own take on events in occupied France and into Germany as the Allies rolled towards Berlin. Her name was Lee Miller.
She became a war correspondent quite simply because she was aching to be involved in what was going on. And at the time she was working as a fashion photographer in Vogue magazine, and it must have seemed a bit superfluous to be taking pictures of frocks and handbags when she knew that in Paris the dearest friends that she had were suffering greatly under the German occupation, and nightly the whole city of London was taken apart by the Luftwaffe. So she wanted to do something that was really relevant to the time. But the real moment, the sort of apogee of her career, was shortly after the Normandy landings. And then she went ashore with the US troops, visiting the emergency hospital at La Cambre, just back of Omaha Beach. And really that was where everything came together. She found her voice as a writer. She found her, her style as a photographer was really so appropriate to the kind of pictures that she was taking there. And I think that her finest work began in that moment. The only way to take pictures of fighting is to be really close. And she became a combat photographer at the Siege of San Malo. Lee Miller had been under fire for about 30 days. Not continuously, but it added up to about 30 days. That's a very long time to be exposed to enemy fire, and to survive too. She had some very close, very near misses, but she got away with it.
Following a tip-off from a contact, she and her fellow Life magazine photographer David Sherman discovered Hitler's apartment in Munich.
The first thing that struck them was that in the whole of Munich it was the only place with hot water, because all the coal had dried up and been used up, you see. So Sherman said to me, we stank. We hadn't had our clothes off in 3 weeks, and this was too much to resist. So they ran a bath, stripped off, hopped in, and then suddenly a little light came on and said, hey, we've got a scoop. They put the photograph of Hitler on the edge of the bath to demonstrate exactly where they were. They dragged one of his little kitsch nude sculptures in and put that on the other side. That's Lee's uniform on the chair. And what in fact it is like Lee establishing herself as a victor in this bath. The really extraordinary thing for me is if you look closely at the boots, they have stamped muck and filth into the bath mat. Now, you have to remember that the morning of the day that Lee was in this tub, she was photographing at Dachau. So the muck and the filth and the ash from Dachau is what she has stamped into Hitler's pristine bath mat here. And that is, I think for me, one of the most extraordinary images of closure.
War reporting takes many forms. Linda Kitson's drawings have been seen in exhibitions. Lee Miller's photographs have achieved iconic status. But do women have a different attitude to conflict and reporting it? Photographer Jenny Matthews involves herself in all aspects of conflict, from covering the marches against war to the wars themselves. Why does she risk her life, and what does she hope to achieve?
I want my photos to inform, to move people. I had an exhibition recently in London, and it was very moving for me how much time people spent looking and reading. We live in a society where we assume that people don't read anymore. Of course, it's very easy to not be aware of what's going on, but there are different ways of getting to audiences. I've had amazing experiences in Afghanistan. I first went there when the Russians were there in the late 80s, and I've been back, I think, 4 times since, before the Taliban, during Taliban, and afterwards. And always the sort of warmth of women and the desire to communicate, really. And I think we're all human. We're, you know, it's what makes us human, is sharing experiences and communication.
While Linda Kitson recorded the war with the adrenaline pumping in the Falklands, Jenny Matthews sees war from other perspectives. She attends anti-war marches and takes shots of the demonstrators. The faces of the various anti-war groupings, she says, are familiar to her. Because she works both for herself as an artist and also as a hired freelance photographer finding the buyers once she's back home, she's able to choose her subjects and often revisit them.
I've just been to Iraq, and I was doing a story for BBC Magazine on a woman I'd first met in 1999, and we were looking for Bader. And again, that was brilliant to see her and to see the war through her eyes and to listen to her stories, and then to walk around Baghdad and for Bader to tell us what had been happening to her in the last few years. Again, with Sierra Leone, there's one woman, Fina, who was just such a fantastic person. She'd been chopped, as she puts it, which meant one of her arms was chopped off by rebel children. And she's such a strong character who was determined that she was going to learn to use her prosthetic arm, and that she was going to, again, her daughter was also chopped, and that she was going to make a future for her child.
Jenny Matthews carries on the tradition of Lee Miller as a chronicler of man's cruelty to man and woman. Lee Miller was following an army, an international alliance, fighting and defeating fascism. Did she wonder what she would have done if she were attacked while working amidst the anarchy of war? If the end justified the means? Jenny has seen many women who, from necessity and belief, have taken up arms.
For some, being a fighter is a great liberation, if you like. It's girls being able to do what boys normally do. That a lot of the young fighters I've met in Central America, in Africa, it's power, it's all the reasons why men are interested in fighting as well, and strutting around with guns, I suppose.
But it's perhaps in my world of television journalism that women have come closest to combat. Does being a woman make a difference to the attitude of others, or the flavour and emphasis of the reports produced? Martha Gellhorn, seen by many as the trailblazing war reporter, used a tone and technique that was all her own. As a print journalist covering the Spanish Civil War in 1936, she looked behind the big picture to let the detail tell the story.
She would talk about people picking up smashed cups and saucers or a dead canary from a sideboard, and really convey how the everyday substance of life was being destroyed in Madrid. Her sympathies were definitely liberal. She was clearly pro-Republican, and she also talked about their resilience, their stoicism, the fact that they would make houses in ruined buildings and continue as far as possible with their own war. It was definitely, I think, a female perspective. She didn't write very much about heroism or action. Her stuff is a quiet journalism of a city undergoing an awful experience. She makes her name in Spain, and I'm sure one of the reasons for that is because her writing, her copy is so distinctive, because it does talk to a different audience. It isn't simply written for people who put pins in maps to plot out troop movements or who are interested in strategy. It's much more emotional. It connects in a more direct way, I think, with the people whose lives she's writing about. It seems to me to be much more clearly aimed at a general audience who are not themselves involved in war and who are not particularly interested in tanks and boats and planes, and that would have included many, many women.
Upstairs, the family, including the husband's sister and mother and the wife's niece and her baby, were standing in their living room, getting used to what had happened. The front wall was gone. The china was broken, and the chairs. The wife said to me, "What a shame for the sewing machine. It will never work again." The husband picked up a thin, dead canary off the sideboard and showed it to me, sadly, shrugged, and said nothing.
Martha Gellhorn was seen as a woman in a man's world, the same situation as today, though many more women are now reporting. In the war of words and pictures, women are no longer just the subjects. They're the authors.
You have to have nerve. I think you have to be able to deal with risk. You have to be able to accept the fact that things are very unpredictable and can change very, very fast and will be outside your control. There are certainly sensible things you can do, like building up local knowledge, working with colleagues that you trust, basic things like not travelling after dark if you can. And you do all of that and you say to yourself, well, that way I'm reducing the danger, and you hope that you are. But in your heart of hearts, you also know that simply being there is putting yourself at risk, and you have to be able to accept that. It's really a matter of relying on your instinct and the instinct of the people that you're travelling with. And if somebody doesn't feel happy about being in a place, if somebody has a bad feeling, then you go. And there are days when you have that unlucky feeling, and there are days when you wonder, you know, is something going to happen? But you have to be able to combat that and go out and do the job. And if circumstances are changing very fast, and if a situation is too dangerous, there are moments when you have to leave, because at the end of the day, what you have to be in a position to do is come back alive with the footage and with the story. In the last 10 years, let's say, there are a generation of women like myself who can do the work that we want to do in the way that we want to do it. In the recent Gulf War, for example, in the occupation of Iraq, we had women who were embedded in frontline units. We had women who were reporting very courageously from Baghdad throughout the war. We had women in every part of that conflict. And I think undoubtedly for women of my era, you know, we are here because other women have gone before us and have carved out a path. But I'd like to think that in the next 10 years, this debate will be redundant, and they won't be seeing a difference between the male and female reporters who are doing it.
War is frequently traumatizing, and it's often assumed that it's a bringer of nightmares even to those reporting it.
I don't have bad dreams. I occasionally have sleepless nights, quite rarely, and I do have bad memories. I think when you do this work, you see things that you would love to be able to forget and that you never will. But that is the price of doing the job, and you have to be prepared to take that step, and you have to be prepared to witness what it is that you will see. I think the most difficult thing is when friends and colleagues are injured or killed, and that does bring the risks home to you. Then you realise that you are vulnerable, and the fact that you have been able to do this job safely for 6 years or 10 years doesn't mean that you will be safe every single time.
Women have played their parts, illustrious and less illustrious, in the fields of war propaganda, the artistic interpretation of conflict, and the reporting of war and its victims. Women such as Boadicea, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Joan of Arc inspired and led armies. Others, like Flora Sands and Florence Nightingale, risked their lives to save others. Felicia Brown and Edith Cavell paid with theirs for their beliefs. Is there a glass ceiling women have yet to reach as their role in direct conflict increases, or could they go all the way?
Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the new Supreme Commander of European Land Forces, General Stephanie Huguenot.
Well, you never know. Throughout history, women have been celebrated as carers of the wounded, as well as being executed for sleeping with the enemy. This programme explores the history of women at war behind the scenes, in their traditional role of tending the sick and injured, but also as agents in wartime espionage, the Spies and Angels. The idea of women being part of an army is not a modern one. In the Middle Ages, they helped to form what was almost an additional force to the main body of an army. They were called camp followers.
Well, camp followers were very common in the Middle Ages. You had women who were, in a sense, support troops, playing a variety of roles, but of course many of those roles are roles nobody wanted to talk about, like the camp follower. So wherever an army went, and armies in the Middle Ages were quite small by modern comparison, modern standards, you had this movement of people along with them that included many women.
So by following the army, tending to the wounds of the soldiers, and often providing for virtually all their needs, women were becoming an integral part of the war machine. And women weren't becoming involved in conflicts just as amateur medics. By the time of the English Civil War in 1642, there were already accounts of women acting as spies.
In general, women spies operate as scouts, as informants, as couriers. There are a few examples of anonymous women who just show up in the records doing things like serving as an informant once and being paid a small fee. There's also examples of women who serve as a scout over and over again.
Women on the battlefield were useful in the baggage train, though to be part of one was not considered entirely respectable. Nursing, too, was something of a euphemism, not at all a job for a lady. But the popular perception of the nurse was about to be changed by one woman, Florence Nightingale, who learnt her skills at a small hospital for sick gentlemen in London's Harley Street. She was asked by Sidney Herbert, the Minister for War, to lead a party of 38 nurses and take over the running of the military hospital at Scutari in Turkey.
There were certain people in the government, particularly her sponsor, Sidney Herbert, the Minister of War, who regarded Florence Nightingale as a potential saviour of a very bad situation. Sidney Herbert was a reformer, so several of the reformers in the government saw Florence Nightingale as a means of actually bringing some positive result from an otherwise very negative situation.
An angel of mercy was just what the British government needed in its search to provide a positive image of the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale's sober outfit certainly helped cement that positive image of frontline nurses in the public mind. She looked almost like a nun, at once efficient, angelic, and untouchable. The myth of the angelic nurse was born. Florence Nightingale wrote in her diary, "It may seem a strange principle to enunciate as the very first requirement in a hospital that it should do the sick no harm. But at Scutari, she and her team of nurses put that strange principle into practice." Thanks to her endeavours, the death rate in Crimean War hospitals was reduced by 40%. Some women who ministered to the injured at the front combined their medical role with another activity, spying. The strategic position of field hospitals and the ability of nurses to move about relatively freely meant that women were ideally placed to act as scouts and provide valuable information about the enemy. 5 years after the hostilities had ceased in the Crimea, the American Civil War broke out. It was to rage from 1861 to 1865 and present women with many opportunities to combine these roles. Indeed, there are countless examples of women who took to spying with enthusiasm. Of the most colourful was Dr. Mary Walker from Oswego, New York.
When the war broke out, Dr. Walker tried vainly to receive a surgeon's commission from the federal government in the Union Army. She presented her credentials and her diploma, but was repeatedly turned down. Washington said they didn't hire women doctors. Ever persistent, Dr. Walker found a state regiment, an Ohio regiment, that really wanted a regimental surgeon, and they didn't care if the surgeon was male or female.
Walker was certainly enthusiastic. She tended to the wounded at the Battle of First Manassas in 1861 and later at the Battle of Chickamauga, Tennessee in 1863. She was captured at Virginia in 1864 and spent 4 months in prison in Richmond before she was released in a prison exchange. Dr. Walker wasted no time and went straight back to work serving at the Battle of Atlanta in September 1864. During her time as regimental surgeon, the intrepid Walker continually crossed Confederate lines to treat civilians, and it's believed that she took the opportunity while in enemy territory to act as a spy. But the opportunity for women to act as spies was not confined to those who had an active role at the front. Some came from non-military and sometimes quite exotic backgrounds. One-time actress Major Pauline Cushman, for example.
The newspapers branded her a Southern sympathizer, which of course landed her in the company of other Southern sympathizers and Southern military officials who were now inviting her to parties and attending her performances.
The resourceful Cushman made herself a favourite of Union troops and is reputed to have gathered information on troop movements and strategies, which proved very useful to Union General William Rosecrans. But on one sortie, believing that she had gathered enough useful information, Cushman headed back to Union lines, only to have her cover blown. She was captured by Braxton Bragg's troops and subjected to a drumhead court-martial.
Some stories say they were going to hang her, but their lines were overrun and she was saved at the last minute by Union troops. Whether or not her life was actually in jeopardy is subject to debate. However, she became even more famous as an actress after her return to Union lines.
The accounts of Cushman's exploits were lapped up by an excited public, all too happy to celebrate a romantic heroine who had been rescued a mere 3 days before she was due to be executed. Abraham Lincoln even awarded Cushman an honorary major's commission. No longer able to act as a spy, Pauline Cushman returned to the stage, donned her honorary uniform, and embarked on a tour with circus entrepreneur P.T. Barnum, during which she enthusiastically recounted her adventures to her audiences.
He advertised her in his circus as the Spy of the Cumberland in 1864. She made a lot out of her role as a spy in the war, but I'm not sure she really did very much.
Whether Pauline Cushman's contribution was important or simply a good career move is perhaps debatable. But one thing is certain, women spies were vital to the tactics of both sides in the American Civil War. By the turn of the century, the great powers of Europe were well on their way to forming themselves into two powerful, well-armed alliances that were to bring a horrific war to the entire continent. In Britain, these events were played out against the backdrop of the burgeoning suffragette movement that aimed to secure the vote for women, a movement which was to radically accelerate the progress of women in the fields of espionage and frontline medicine. The staunch suffragette Mabel Stobart believed that one route to achieving their aims was to make themselves central to the defence of the country should war break out. Born in 1862 into a middle-class family, Stobart led a fairly unremarkable life until she was 40. But her first marriage ended in tragedy when she and her husband lost their fortune on the stock market, and after a brief and difficult spell in South Africa, Stobart's husband died in 1906.
She returned to England a widow with the need to throw herself into something else. And what she did was start the Women's Convoy Corps in 1909, which was basically an organisation of medical women set up in a military style who were set up in order to prove that women could do their bit during war as well, to be ready if anything happened.
With the help of Lady Muir Mackenzie, Stobart subsequently oversaw the formation of the Women's National Service League. After the success of the Women's Convoy Corps, she approached the British Red Cross for support, but was told by the chairman, Sir Frederick Greaves, that there was not work fitted for women in the sphere of war. Undeterred, the formidable duo garnered support, and the WNSL led to the establishment of a hospital in Belgium, the first to be completely staffed by women.
They were overrun there by the Germans, and Mabel Stobart was held prisoner for a while and in danger of being shot as a spy. But she was released, she did get away, and as soon as she got back, she reformed her unit and went over to Serbia. And she set up a number of hospital units around Serbia. She was a commandant, and she was quite an imposing figure. She used to ride a black horse all around Serbia.
She met the King of Serbia, who she got on with very well. He made her a major in his Serbian army. And that's what she did all through the retreat, the Serbian retreat. She took her convoy of helpers all through the Montenegrin mountains, and great hardships, I think.
There were indeed great hardships, and Stobart was now 53 years old and commanding a medical convoy that was supporting an army in full retreat. She often spent 18 hours a day on horseback as they trekked through the mountains in very harsh winter conditions.
She has a wonderful little diary, which is sort of this big, and you can visualise her writing. It looks as though she's writing it on the horse because it's almost illegible, but it records everything that they do and all the experience of the retreat. She then went on lecture tours, speaking tours in Britain and indeed in America to present her ideas, having created this base so that people knew who she was.
Mabel Stobart continued to write about her experiences until her death in 1954. She is buried here in Dorset, where her family still celebrates her life, her achievements, and her steadfast belief that the more women became involved in wartime activities, the more doors would open for them elsewhere. Mabel Stobart's Convoy Corps pushed the boundaries of what was considered an acceptable role for the female nurse, but there were still no female doctors at the front. In fact, there weren't many female doctors at all. Elsie Inglis, however, was a qualified doctor with a fierce determination to change things. She faced stiff resistance from the British War Office at the outbreak of World War I. "My good lady, go home and sit still," she was told when she proposed sending medical units entirely staffed by women to the front lines. But the determined Inglis, a formidable Scot, was not to be so bluntly dissuaded. With the support of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, she formed the Scottish Women's Hospital Committee. 3 months after the outbreak of war, the first hospital unit, complete with women doctors, landed in France.
The story about the War Office saying, "My good lady, Go Home and Sit Still, is very specifically directed at Elsie Inglis. I think because the Scottish women's hospitals were independent and they were entirely women, they perhaps had a different kind of status to the Red Cross. Military hospitals were happy to welcome Red Cross VADs inside to do various different types of employment. But I think it was the notion of the woman doctor was something that they couldn't really deal with. There'd never actually been women doctors before, and that was what Inglis was proposing. Her hospital units were staffed entirely with women. They didn't have any male employees, and they managed to retain that throughout the war.
In 1915, Inglis established an auxiliary hospital with 200 beds in Royaumont Abbey and sent female medical units to Serbia. In all, 14 units were sent to places as far apart as France, Corsica, Salonika, Romania, Russia and Malta. The success of the units was undeniable and support grew. The London Suffrage Society funded Inglis and 80 women to go to Russia to support troops who were fighting there. Those who had initially opposed her efforts now saw how well organised and effective her hospital units were.
I think it was the womanness of it, the femaleness of the institution that made the War Office uncomfortable in the first instance. However, I do think that their perception of her changed during the course of the war, and it is possible to argue that she did have some influence with the War Office by about 1917, when she campaigned to get the Serbian army removed from Russia during the revolutionary period because she was anxious about their safety. And it seems to be the case that the Serbs at least believed that she had influence with the War Office to get them moved, because they were moved.
But the role of women at the front was becoming more blurred. After all, how different was it to help heal a soldier and then help him get home to his family? Far from finding protection because of their caring roles, nurses now often found themselves placed in greater danger. No one more famously so than Nurse Edith Cavell. Edith Cavell was an ordinary middle-class woman from the city of Norwich in eastern England. In 1907, she went to Brussels to run a nurses' training school, and she remained there after war broke out in 1914.
Perhaps the story would have just remained a story of her, nursing and teaching nurses in Brussels if she hadn't taken in 2 Allied soldiers in November of 1914. These were soldiers that had been separated from their troops and found themselves in occupied territory. She harbored those soldiers in the hospital, in the training school, and it began a career, basically, for the next few months of harboring hundreds of Allied soldiers and refugees. From the training school, there was a courier network set up, and Edith Cavell would harbor the soldiers. Couriers would pick them up and take them into neutral Holland.
Cavell was part of a network of 35 men and women who secretly helped wounded Allied soldiers return to their units. However, when 2 of the network were arrested, Cavell was identified from papers that they were carrying, and 5 days later, she too was arrested by the Germans. Having been allegedly tricked into confessing by her captors, she was subsequently tried and found guilty of spying. Edith Cavell was sentenced to death by firing squad, and her sentence was carried out in the early hours of October the 12th, 1915.
The Germans initially tried to use her death as a warning to others not to help Allied soldiers and not to aid the enemy in any way. The British tried to use her death for propaganda purposes and also as a recruitment tool. So many postcards and posters started appearing showing her as a prone victim with a kind of demonic German soldier standing over her, holding a pistol to her head often. She's always portrayed as a victim, and these propaganda postcards really got the public going, not only in Britain, but interestingly enough in neutral countries like the United States and in France also. Other combatant countries. There is some evidence also that recruitment numbers went up in Britain in October and November of that year, and it's often attributed to her death and the publicity that surrounded it.
After her execution, the world's press seized upon Edith Cavell's story, and in Britain she became a martyr. But the way that her image was exploited for propaganda purposes was somewhat at odds with her own stoicism. Shortly before her execution, she wrote,
"I'm thankful for these 10 weeks of quiet to get ready. Now I have had them and have been kindly treated. I expected my sentence and believe it was just. Standing as I do, in view of God and eternity, I realise that patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone.
Cavell has become ingrained in popular consciousness as a martyr. But she was not the only woman to take risks in order to help servicemen. Indeed, many women were now risking their lives to join organised groups who were involved in dangerous resistance work. One of the most successful such operations was the White Lady Network in Belgium in 1917. The White Ladies watched the train network and gathered information on troop and munitions movements. They worked as couriers within occupied territory and also across the frontier between Belgium and Holland, which was particularly dangerous at first because of the number of guards and formidable barbed wire defences. Later, the Germans put up electrified fences, but the White Ladies were undeterred. They donned rubber suits to protect themselves.
The network had over 1,000 Belgian and French citizens. About a third of those were women. And it was also unusual in that they worried about the men being arrested by the German authorities or sent to forced labor camps. And so they created an entirely feminine executive as well as a shadow executive for the network. So there was a male leadership and a female leadership, and some of the battalions were commanded by women as well. So it was an opportunity really for women to serve Belgium and to feel like they were doing something in this very horrible position of being a victim otherwise.
While the work of the intrepid White Ladies may have been largely forgotten, one whose name has become synonymous with the dangerous world of espionage during World War I is the Dutch dancer and prostitute Margaretha Gertrude Zeller, better known to history by her stage name, Mata Hari. Born in the northern Dutch town of Leeuwarden, Mata Hari married a Dutch colonial officer with whom she had 2 children. She joined him in Java, but after a tempestuous marriage that lasted 7 years, the couple separated while on their return home. Margaretha took off for Paris. So how did this young Dutch woman acquire the iconic status of the world's most infamous female spy?
She moved to Paris and reinvented herself, which was kind of a talent of hers. She named herself Mata Hari, which supposedly translates as Eye of the Dawn, and she began dancing in what she called Javanese dancing, but it's basically erotic dancing in Paris. This was around 1905, 1907.
So did the activities of this female spy live up to the top billing she has enjoyed ever since as a femme fatale?
Mata Hari is approached in 1915 by the German Secret Service, and she does work for German intelligence, but only insofar as she gets money from them and she agrees to give them information. But she literally says she takes her bottles of secret ink and throws them into a canal and is not interested in doing anything, and she doesn't do anything. Later on, she's approached by the French counterintelligence and agrees to work for them. So in her mind, she's operating as a double agent, and she does attempt to give them whatever information she can. But in fact, the whole idea of her having hundreds of lovers and sleeping with men in order to get information out of them is really based on a kind of myth.
Many of the myths that surround Mata Hari portray her as a ruthless seductress, but history suggests that she was an unfortunate victim, the wrong woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Today, her trial might simply be dismissed with no case to answer. But in 1917, Mata Hari was a woman caught up in a situation that she had no hope of controlling, where those she trusted would ultimately betray her.
Like many women spies who were caught, Mata Hari was actually betrayed by someone close to her. One of her German lovers betrayed her to the French authorities, and so she was actually arrested for spying for the Germans by the French, when she maintained all along that it was the French that really had her loyalty.
Major Kalle, the German military attaché, sent a message to Berlin in a code that he knew the Allies could read, saying that spy H21 had proved valuable. The French authorities arrested Mata Hari on February the 13th, 1917. She was put on trial, found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. On the 15th of October 1917, Mata Hari went to her death, refusing to be tied to a stake or to wear a blindfold, and blowing kisses to the firing squad. Despite not being a terribly effective spy, Mata Hari's name has become synonymous with intrigue and sexual allure that has informed popular perceptions of the female spy. Arguably, the all-pervasive image of Mata Hari has overshadowed the real achievements of the many women spies who were operating during the First World War.
They were really responsible for tracking most of the espionage activity for the Allied armies. They also served as effective spies behind the lines in occupied territories in a variety of roles as couriers, as train watchers, trying to determine how many troops and munitions were going through Belgium. And it's hard to say they were 90% effective or to give a quantitative answer. But it is significant that the British networks, for instance, in Belgium, knew the location of most of the German units by the end of the war. So they were getting information through.
But increasingly, spying wasn't the only reason that women found themselves at the front. In the 1930s, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, the artist Felicia Brown set out for the front to paint, but she was also ready to defend herself and fight for a cause she believed in. Friends of her family still remember the artist come volunteer.
She was a great friend of my grandfather's when he was at university at Cambridge in the 30s, and the drawings we have are drawings that she sent back to him from Spain at the time. She originally went to Spain to paint, but she was actually quite conscious of what was going on in the political situation, to the extent that famously she took self-defense lessons from a small recorded as being rather a diminutive Chinese gentleman in Harley Street. So she would go and do Chinese self-defense because she knew that she fully intended to get involved in the conflict. This really wasn't for the faint-hearted. This involved guns, bombs, sabotage. I think if you wanted a comparison, it'd be a bit like joining the French resistance during the Nazi occupation. One image was made before she left England to join the Spanish militia of a man in Shoreditch with a naphtha lamp, which is a kind of lamp used during power cuts and bombing in the East End of London. And the second drawing is typical of the drawings that she sent back from Spain. She made a lot of works on whatever material she could find, brown paper, bits of canvas, the back of books, sketchbooks, and posted them back to friends. And they're drawings really of typical working Spanish farmers, Spanish peasants, and also, very importantly, Spanish communists, trade union leaders, Spanish rebels, the left-wing soldiers, and people like herself who joined the militia.
Felicia was one of 2,000 or so volunteers who went to Spain from Britain. The men fought at the front, but the Republican leadership began to discourage women from doing so. They felt that the image of women fighting portrayed the wrong image for their cause. But this change of heart came too late for Felicia Brown. As one of the first volunteers to make for the front, she was involved in heavy fighting. She was shot outside the town of Saragossa on the 25th of August 1936. She was 34.
She actually travelled with the militia to Aragon in southern Spain, where they were trying to intercept a train loaded with fascist weapons. And during the sortie, she was trying to help her colleague, a militiaman, escape from fascist fire, and she was actually shot and killed. She became a sort of figurehead of a sort of martyr to the cause, if you like, as a woman, as an artist, and also as a fighter, and became very, very well known for the fact that she was killed.
Women had certainly established their usefulness as spies in 20th century warfare. Government's policies were driven both by a realisation of the value of women's contribution during wartime and, more cynically, by the necessity of finding more hands to do the work. The British government now organised female agents to fight behind enemy lines, perhaps most famously with the establishment in Britain in 1940 of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. This mobilisation of women into a government-sanctioned organisation marked the opening of a new and radically more dangerous chapter. About a quarter of those in the SOE were female. So what did these women have to offer?
The first recruiting officer for F section, which operated in France, was Lewis Gielgud, who was the brother of the actor John Gielgud. The second recruiting officer was Selwyn Jepson, and it was his decision to recruit women to the organisation. I think that he felt that women would bring to the organisation various skills that perhaps men didn't have. For example, the fact that women were beyond suspicion. German soldiers were slow to realise that women were politicised and were involved in the resistance. So there's a number of reasons, I think, that why women were chosen.
One woman who took up the challenge that SOE presented was Oxford graduate Daphne Park, now Baroness Park of Monmouth, a woman who went on to have a high-profile career in British intelligence.
So they sent me off to the country, to a country house, as always happened then, and we scrubbed floors and we learnt to march under an unfortunate Guard Sergeant Major. And we also were taught the rudiments of agent codes, codes used in the field by members of the resistance. And we also learnt wireless operating. And they decided that I was a better bet as a codist than a wireless operator. And I sat the exam. And so I was made an instructor. And in fact, I was a wonderful instructor because I'd made all the mistakes that the agents were ever likely to make and a few more. And I could foresee exactly what they were going to do because I did it. And I found myself, most of the time then, I was instructing individual agents, very important ones, back from the field, who sometimes were working in this part of SOE that worked with General de Gaulle, and sometimes were working in what was called the Buckmaster section, which was purely British.
Female agents were only sent into France as couriers and wireless operators, and not as arms instructors, saboteurs and organisers. Pearl Withington is an interesting case in point because she was sent into France as a courier, but following the arrest of her organiser Maurice Southgate, she actually assumed his masculine role as organiser and was in charge of 3,000 to 4,000 men. So it just suggests that women could undertake these roles when circumstances necessitated.
Many worked tirelessly and anonymously and with enormous bravery. Of the 53 women agents operating in France, the Germans executed 12, and 29 were either arrested or died in captivity.
One of the wonderful things about being in SOE was that you met so many brave people. Courage was the order of the day with so many of the people you dealt with, in fact all of them.
One of these courageous women was SOE operative Odette Sansom. When she and her SOE controller and colleague Peter Churchill were captured, they claimed to be married. Odette took most of the blame for their activities and also started a rumour that Peter was related to Winston Churchill. He was treated comparatively leniently, while she suffered harshly at the hands of the Gestapo. After the war, they did actually marry.
This beautifully crafted doll was made by the SOE agent Odette Sansom, who was parachuted into France in 1942, working for British intelligence services, trying to link up with the resistance network in France. She was captured by the Gestapo and taken to prison in France, and then transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, which is where she made this doll. Although the doll is beautifully made and a wonderful sort of memento of her time there, the time she spent there was actually pretty hideous. She was very badly tortured. She was left in solitary confinement with no windows for months on end, and somehow managed to keep the strength up to be able to create things like this, but also to come home and tell her story to the world afterwards.
Odette Churchill's achievements were widely recognised, but many other women never received the credit that they deserved and were simply sent back to resume their pre-war lives. Even today, their efforts remain largely unsung. World War II showed that even if women weren't allowed to fight at the front, many wanted to record events there, but were prevented by officialdom from doing so. Sometimes, however, the opportunity presented itself in unexpected ways. Doris Zinkhuisen had a successful career as a set designer and worked on many prominent productions. Having worked as a volunteer in London for the St John's Ambulance, Zinkhuisen was commissioned to paint scenes of the Red Cross at work in Belgium, France and Germany, but only at the very end of the war.
Doris Zinkhuisen was an artist who was commissioned in 1941 by the War Artists Advisory Commission to paint fairly kind of standard scenes of the Women's Royal Naval Service going about their business. And then she, towards the end of the war, she joined the Red Cross, and she was one of the first people to enter Belsen in April 1945. And the scenes that faced her when she went into the camp, I think, must have stuck with her very vividly in her mind. The painting that she did, called Belsen 1945, of sprawling, emaciated bodies just left in piles beneath the trees, is a very shocking, very harrowing one, and one which I think kind of conveys the sense of bitterness that must have faced her and others who spent time with the victims and sadly the dead in those first weeks after the camp was liberated.
Far away from the vivid brutality of 1940s Europe, in London 2003, Emily Young was given the chance to create a generic image for the Imperial War Museum's Women at War exhibition. She had to portray a mythical warrior, the Greek goddess Athene, as honestly as possible, devoid of fanciful additional propaganda.
I was asked to do a piece for the Imperial War Museum's Women in War exhibition, and along the lines of a woman warrior. And who came to mind immediately was Athene. She was a great warrior. She's almost always seen with her helmet on, because she's out there doing battle. At the same time, she was the goddess of justice. She would make the rules. She established Athenian justice system, which we still use today. So she's a good example of a woman warrior.
The myth of Athene is all about her warrior attributes. She's supposed to have sprung fully armed from the forehead of her father Zeus, ruler of the gods. It was Athene he trusted with the keys to his thunderbolts, and she rescued Heracles, Perseus and Odysseus when they were in danger. For her sculpture, Emily Young tried to focus on the essential Athene, producing a simple but distinctive work of art.
She's going to be in a rather dark place, set back in a recess, and so you're coming through darkness and you just see her sort of glowing a bit in this recess. And she's meant to look like something you're not quite sure what you're looking at. It could be very, very old. And I like that sense that, in fact, women in war is a very, very, very old subject. It's been going on since the dawn of mankind. I mean, and, you know, before.
Women have been at war for centuries in various roles. Ironically, it has often been war itself that has heightened their expectations and made careers previously dominated by males more accessible. This was true when the Second World War ended in 1945. Society was changing fast, with more and more women entering both medicine and espionage. At the same time, dramatic changes in both fields were taking place, but it was often technology that was spearheading progress as much as social pressure. In the USA, the Women in Military Service Memorial in Washington commemorates the exploits of women in the first major post-war conflicts in Korea and Vietnam.
Korea, North Korea. A satellite controlled by the Soviet Union as a result of the Second World War. North Korea, an armed camp.
The only women who were sent into the battlefield in Korea were nurses. These were Army nurses, Navy nurses, and nurses of the American Air Force. We believe that approximately 1,000 women served as nurses during the Korean War in what we refer to as MASH units. And the most important thing about the MASH units during the Korean War was that they were highly mobile. You have to remember this was an exceptionally mobile war. The front lines changed dramatically, constantly, in a way that the military couldn't predict. And so in many cases, these MASH nurses ended up far closer to the front lines than they had anticipated, or their military commanders had anticipated, or the American public had any thought that they were that close.
But the fluid nature of the conflict was not replicated in the Vietnam War, where field hospitals were often in the same place for long periods.
For nurses who were assigned to what we call field hospitals or station hospitals in Vietnam, there was a constant danger of capture by North Vietnamese guerrillas. And of course there was the danger, physical danger of being shot or having your hospital bombed.
We were issued flak jackets and helmets, and every time there was something overhead, of course, we had to don our flak jackets and helmet and spent the time underneath our beds. We tended to have a good time then, and we talked to each other as we were trying not to be frightened. Again, nothing came close to the facility, although those were rather trying times. You just never knew.
During the Vietnam War, huge advances in casualty evacuation techniques meant the wounded could be extracted from the battle and taken to the hospitals far more quickly. In the 21st century, once again, it is organisations operating outside the direct control of government, with a humanitarian rather than a political agenda, that are leading the way in providing medical services in the conflicts across the globe. Today, many women are routinely instrumental in both the medical care and the organisation of such services. Jackie Tong is one of the key operational staff of the French-based Médecins Sans Frontières.
Well, I often take on several hats, but when I'm in the field, as we call it, sur le terrain, somewhere like Liberia or Sierra Leone or what have you, I normally take the position of medical coordinator to do risk analysis for what sort of emergencies might we encounter. If it's in an unstable zone, it might turn hot, and to do emergency preparation for that.
If the role of women in war has changed, the scarcely believable cruelty of man to man has not.
The Hutu extremists initiated the genocide. There was reprisals all over the place. Oh, I had one day where I never wanted to see another Hutu again, and it was after one of our patients got stoned to death by 50 other patients, men, women and children, accused of being a spy. And I can still see that like a tableau in my head across the volcanic plain, and this man, brains all over the place, still reflex breathing, and this gang of people laughing. But then you have to tell yourself, okay, these people are incredibly psychologically damaged by the whole experience. It was a brutal, brutal genocide, and you just have to like shake it down and keep working, and then something will come along that will make it all worthwhile. I've had a few moments, am I going to get out of this? We had an assassination attempt in Somalia, missed one of us by 30 centimetres. Sometimes you feel intimidated by the most ridiculous things, and again, it was at a checkpoint. I was illegally in a country, crossing through, without borders, and I had a bunch of Serbs in uniform, and these guys are scary, and I was like, yep, I know I'm wrong, and I really don't want to end up in jail as a spy in Belgrade. And it was just one of those moments that you just suddenly realise the vulnerability. It's fraught with its dangers, but then just so is walking out onto the street, and we do take care.
Another woman who has seen the indiscriminate brutality of modern war and wanted to do something about it, whatever the danger, is Jenny Matthews, a freelance photographer. She involves herself in all aspects of conflict, from covering the marches against the war to the wars themselves. Why does she risk her life, and what does she hope to achieve?
I want my photos to inform, to move people. I had an exhibition recently in London, and it was very moving for me how much time people spent looking and reading. We live in a society where we assume that people don't read anymore. Of course, it's very easy to not be aware of what's going on, but there are different ways of getting to audiences. I've had amazing experiences in Afghanistan. I first went there when the Russians were there in the late 80s, and I've been back, I think, 4 times since, before the Taliban, during Taliban, and afterwards. And always the sort of warmth of women and the desire to communicate, really. And I think we're all human. We're, you know, it's what makes us human, is sharing experiences and yeah, communication.
Jenny attends anti-war marches and takes shots of the demonstrators. The faces of the various anti-war groupings, she says, are familiar to her. Because she works mainly for herself as an artist, rather than as a hired freelance photographer, and often finds the buyers once she's back home, she is able to choose her subjects and often revisit them.
I've just been to Iraq, and I was doing a story for BBC Magazine on a woman I'd first met in 1999, and we were looking for Bader. And again, that was brilliant to see her and to see the war through her eyes and to listen to her stories, and then to walk around Baghdad and for Bader to tell us what had been happening to her in the last few years. Again, with Sierra Leone, there's one woman, Fina, who was just such a fantastic person. She'd been chopped, as she puts it, which meant one of her arms was chopped off by rebel children. And she's such a strong character who was determined that she was going to learn to use her prosthetic arm, and that she was going to, again, her daughter was also chopped, and that she was going to make a future for her child.
Jenny Matthews carries on the tradition of such photographers as Lee Miller. Both are chroniclers of man's cruelty to man and woman. She has also seen many women who, from necessity and belief, have taken up arms.
For some, being a fighter is a great liberation, if you like. It's girls being able to do what boys normally do. That a lot of the young fighters I've met in Central America, in Africa, it's power, it's all the reasons why men are interested in fighting as well, and strutting around with guns, I suppose.
Journalism and nursing have put 21st century women firmly in the front line. Meanwhile, the technological advances made in espionage have altered and expanded the role of women in intelligence gathering.
Spy satellites have long since removed the need for so many agents on the ground. Today's spy is more likely to be found behind a desk than hiding out in a Russian wood.
If you were to look at a room full of Central Intelligence Agency area experts, those who really provide the briefing reports for the president to look at every morning, you're going to see 40%, half of them being women. They have to know a lot of history, they have to know languages, they have to be prepared to analyze tremendous amounts of data. And that takes a certain kind of skill that women are certainly capable of earning, of achieving.
The history of women as spies and wartime nurses remains littered with popular myths. The exotic Mata Hari, the martyr Edith Cavell. What is indisputable is that they all risked their lives for their beliefs. Enemies come and enemies go, but women spies and medics retain a prominent position in modern warfare, and without them, the world might be a very different and even more alarming place. The way women have behaved in wartime has often depended on whether the battle was being fought at home or abroad. If it was on the doorstep, they might well be victims caught up in the conflict, facing death. If it was abroad, they could be left literally to keep their country going, as well as helping to supply vital arms and food. This programme tells the story of the women who've helped win the war, not by fighting, but by doing their bit on the home front. Most women on the home front never bore arms or met the enemy face to face, but no conflict could ever have been won without them, because at the most fundamental level, they were mothers of soldiers. Ancient Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta recognized this crucial role, even though women were not accepted as citizens and could not take part in warfare. That women stayed at home didn't guarantee them immunity from the horrors of war. Five centuries before the rise of the city-states, Homer's Iliad gives a graphic account of how a Greek army sacked and burned the city of Troy. Men, women and children were put to the sword, and the city was reduced to ashes. It was a pattern that was to be repeated endlessly in the wars of the city-states and beyond. The medieval view, fostered by the church, was that women were part of the idealized family that the men at the front sought to protect. The image of the wife and children in the cottage doorway represented stability and civilization, something worth fighting and dying for. It's an image that has persisted down the ages.
It's very interesting that during the Middle Ages, when the men went off to fight, many of the women in the noble classes stayed back to deal with these vast landed estates that were the whole basis of the medieval economy. So women were really business women, in effect, because they had to bring in the crops, they had to control the action of the serfs, because serfs were attached to the land, and they often had to play a role in local skirmishes, local warfare, up to and including inspiring some of the men who been left behind, hadn't gone off to fight in order to deal with protection of their estates.
The English Civil War in the 1640s was largely a series of pitched battles across the country, but an estimated 250,000 people died, and many of these were civilians. A higher percentage of the British population was killed in the English Civil War than in the First World War. But it was in France during the Revolution a century and a half later that there was, perhaps for the first time in Europe, an attempt to mobilize an entire population.
And so women would roll bandages, and they would tend to, again, food preparation, and they would be followers of armies in order to provide what these armies needed. So even if a woman wasn't doing anything specific to do with the war, she was still directly involved in the sense that her country was at stake.
During the Napoleonic Wars, the Emperor's armies swept all before them while the British attempted to gain control of the seas. For the women whose men were fighting abroad, home life was little affected. In the war zone, though, it was a different story.
So the women can't help but be involved, but it's usually as the victims of what's going on rather than the agents of what's going on. So there are a variety of ways, depending upon whether the home front is the space that's still protected, hasn't been attacked, or whether the home front is the thing that's under siege, and therefore the women have to rise to the occasion by protecting their homes in a variety of ways, up to and including the use of violence.
50 years later, the New World erupted into civil war. The growth of industrialization in the mid-19th century brought new weapons of war and new terrors to civilian populations. In America in the 1860s, the line between the home front and battle became horribly blurred. Women and their families, overrun by both Confederate and Unionist armies, suffered badly.
There were cases of civilian populations in the South being close to starvation because when the army came through, whether it was their own army or the enemy, took everything they had, their last chicken, their last ear of corn. And so it was very difficult for women in the South living in the parts of the South that were war zones because they were uprooted, they were destitute, they were refugees.
Families wrote to their fighting men, begging them to come home. Here, a Confederate wife, Louise, writes to her husband at the front, effectively pleading with him to desert.
Our son cannot live long for the fix he's in. His earnest calls for Pa almost breaks my heart. John, come if you can. If they will not let you off, I don't know the reason. We ain't got nothing to eat but a little bit of meal. Try to get off and come home and fix us all up some, and then you can go back. If you don't come now, it won't be no use coming. We'll all be in the graveyard, in the garden, with your ma and mine.
The number one reason that men deserted was not because they were tired of being in the army. It was not the horror of being in the army. It was because they had received multiple letters from their wives saying, "You've got to come home. Everything's a mess. We're hungry. We're starving. We're homeless. I can't get the crop in."
Both sides were well aware of the impact of such letters on the morale of soldiers and the impetus it gave to desertion. They also knew that the work that women had taken over in farms and factories was vital. As a direct consequence, the suffering of women left behind was a weakness to be exploited, so homes and families were deliberately targeted. The misery was greatest in the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, where Unionists and Confederates lived side by side. There, families could be divided and civil law break down. Common decency and behavioral norms deteriorated.
There was guerrilla warfare, there were bushwhackers, there were vigilante groups, and families could be burned out of their house just because of the opinion of grandpa. Women and children left destitute, homeless, and in some cases even murdered because of the political opinions of the male members of their family.
But not all women were affected in this way. While the armies of the Union and the Confederacy slugged it out, women who lived far from the front line made their contribution, running businesses, farms and factories, and supporting their men any way they could. In Europe, 50 years later, thousands were dying in the trenches of Passchendaele, their deeds and the extraordinary loss of life described by many poets and writers. One of them was Margaret Postgate Cole, and her poem, The Veteran, records the pathos of a tragedy overtaking a generation. We came upon him sitting in the sun, blinded by war, and left. And past the fence there came young soldiers from the Hand and Flower, asking advice of his experience. And he said this and that, and told them tales, and the nightmares of each empty head blew into air. Then, hearing us beside, "Poor chaps, how'd they know what it's like?" he said. And we stood there and watched him as he sat, turning his sockets where they went away, until it came to one of us to ask, "And you're how old?" 19, the 3rd of May. Women on the home front in the First World War were still working to support their men who were fighting on a scale never before seen. But while much of the effort was still voluntary, some was now actively encouraged and organised by the government. With so many men suddenly plucked from the factories and farms of the nation to go and serve on the Western Front, the Allied governments had a pressing priority. They had to be sure that their armies were well supplied. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act gave the government control of factories, mines and transport, and it set about recruiting women to fill the gaps left by the men at the front. One crucial area of production was arms and munitions. A munitions worker, a Mrs. Hall, wrote of this dangerous work.
Well, everybody seemed unaware of the powder around them, unaware of any danger. Once or twice we heard, "Oh, so-and-so's gone." Perhaps she'd made a mistake and her eye was out, but there wasn't any big explosion during the 3 years I was there. We worked at making these little pellets, very innocent-looking little pellets. Had there been even the slightest grit in those pellets, it would have been goodbye.
Many things in Britain, of course, a lot of what the women can do during the First World War is defined by the class system. What working class women find is that in many cases they're going into jobs which are better organised, in which they have better pay and better conditions. A really good example of this is on the docks in Liverpool, where women start to work on the docks, and previously they've been involved as hawkers, and they've been sort of pushing barrows around, and when they're interviewed by the local press they say it's so much easier unloading a ship than it is pushing a barrow around, and they get proper meal breaks and things as well. So class comes into it quite heavily, but all women come in as well at different levels.
As the war ground painfully on, more women found themselves in uniform, such as those who volunteered for one of the Women's Auxiliary Services, the WACS, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps.
The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was regarded as a rather dubious way for young ladies to spend their time in a lot of cases. There was one joke, would you like a punch on the nose or a whack on the knee, which if you were on leave for the weekend you'd be guaranteed to hear about 200 times. Sort of thing. It got so bad, one of the rumours that went round and gained a lot of currency was that the WACS was just recruiting young ladies for army brothels in France, and this was completely ridiculous, but it was widely believed.
Some of the hostility to the women auxiliaries came from men in the forces themselves, the idea of women in uniform seeming uncomfortable and unnatural, if not offensive.
When women first start getting involved in war activities, there is some male hostility, especially to the uniformed organisations, and there are a lot of outrage letters in the national press saying that it's making a mockery of the King's uniform and women shouldn't be running about in khaki and playing good soldiers. As the war progresses and it more obviously becomes a total war which reconceptualises the arena of battle and involves a home front as well, there is a lot more support for what women are doing. You can trace change in attitudes quite easily through the iconography of recruitment posters, for example, and propaganda posters. At the beginning of the war, you have women standing in windows waving off soldiers who are going to fight. Towards the end of the war, you have women wearing uniforms themselves, encouraging other women to sign up for the auxiliary services.
By the autumn of 1916, German blockades of supplies in the North Sea were starting to bite, and Britain was simply not producing enough at home to feed itself. Women were called on to work on the land, and by 1917 there were over 250,000 women working on farms and in the timber industry. The Women's Land Army was a concept that would be revived some 25 years later in World War II. Thousands of soldiers may have been bogged down in trench warfare in France, but some very English traditions continued despite the fighting abroad and austerity at home. In 1916, a Queen of the May was still crowned in London, and public school chaps still battled it out on the Thames. Divisions of social class that had existed before the war never went away.
For upper class and middle class women, a lot of things really open up for them. The disqualification in many professions is removed, and a few women, for example, go into the law for the first time, having qualified in some cases 20 years previously. Working class women get a much rawer deal. The munitions factories close immediately, and many of them are thrown out, or made unemployed with about 1 week's notice.
But they weren't to be away from the factories for long. In 1939, Britain was at war with Germany once again. But this time, mobilising women was not an experiment, it was a necessity. The Women's Land Army was revived. In 1939, there were 1,000 volunteers, but by the middle years of the war, that number had risen to 80,000, better organised and administered than previously.
Well, the job I did in particular was picking potatoes. Well, we were taken to these fields. Army lorries used to come out and pick us up. Actually, one of the girls was a driver, so she was usually the one that took us. We looked at this field of potatoes and you couldn't see the end of it, literally. We were told to start, and it wasn't sort of like anything mechanical, everything was done by hand. So there we started. We had sacks tied round our middles, and you gather them up, and along you went this line, and you filled this sack, and then every so often there'd be a bag, and you would dump these potatoes in, and that was our first job. Very, very hard work. You were up at the crack of dawn, 6:30, on the lorries at 7 and off, and you worked perhaps 9 o'clock at night before you stopped.
Life for women on the home front in World War II was hard. Some were under the constant threat of bombing, separated from their menfolk and often their children. Food and basic necessities were in short supply, and daily life was often dreary, frequently dangerous and exhausting.
So we spent our nights filling sandbags down on the dock front, making sandbag walls, knitting socks for the soldiers and balaclavas, etc., until the day the dogfight started over the Surrey docks. And from then onwards, the bombing started in earnest.
Every day there was something or other. I mean,
I laugh when they talk about the bomb scares now, because I mean we never knew each day when you set out what we were going to find or what streets we were going to use.
The implications of that for women on the home front in World War II were really that they had an awful lot to cope with just keeping the home going. And that was made more intense by rationing, which was introduced from 1940 and stepped up as the submarine blockade of Britain meant that it was more and more difficult to import goods and more had to be home produced. But obviously there were dire shortages.
If you're reading the bestseller, yes, the ration book, you under 6s and under 18s, look here, you see? Personal points finish here on the page, but don't tear it out. Overleaf, the next lot begins, and they're the ones that bring you extra sweets for Christmas.
You queue at the grocer, you queue at the butcher. You have to be very nice to your grocer and butcher. They have a huge amount of power in the Second World War because it's they who can tell you if there's an extra bit of meat or where the best cut is and so on. Women are having to fulfill all those functions in what I imagine would have been extremely boring and very, very tiring. So they're having to do all the things they always had to do, but they're having to do it under far more difficult conditions. So if your local grocer was bombed, you would have to go quite far afield in order to get food for your family.
If you keep your bread in a tin or bin, make sure that the bread can breathe. If the tin itself has no air holes, then tilt the lid slightly. This way it will keep fresh longer.
Rationing was mainly seen as fair shares for all, though perhaps more in theory than in practice. It was equitable, but women had to be alert to get the best out of the system of coupons and points that applied to both clothing and food. Making limited supplies of food stretch as far as possible and conjuring nourishing meals out of meagre ingredients was an art.
Hello, Tiny. Morning, Tiny.
Morning, Miss Ryan. Sleep well?
Fine, thanks. Wasn't it a quiet night?
Don't know so much. What about the one that came down about 2?
I didn't hear it. Did you? No. Cool, that wasn't Arthur Banger.
There was a strong element of wishful thinking about the notion of cheery Britons keeping their pecker up and coping come what may, but it was widespread. What they understood was that the war could only be won by mobilizing the whole population to defend the country. It was doing your bit, and this has become the image we most associate with the home front in the Second World War. The British government also knew that women were an invaluable force to keep the wheels of the war industries turning and to fill the auxiliary services. But it soon became apparent that relying on volunteers would not be enough.
The government decided during 1941 that it wasn't getting enough women into war industry, into civil defence, which was all the kind of air raid precautions work and ambulance work and so on. And it wasn't getting enough women into the auxiliary forces, to the military. And so during 1941, it took a series of steps leading up to an Act of Parliament in December 1941, which said that all women aged 20 to 30 were liable to call up. That is conscription, but they had a choice between the auxiliaries to the armed forces, civil defence and industry.
Industry frequently meant the munitions factory, dirty, dangerous, but as essential as it had been in the First World War. There were several munitions factories around Darlington, the largest at Aycliffe. The women who worked there called themselves the Aycliffe Angels, believing that the German propagandist known as Lord Haw Haw had broadcast a threat that German bombers would turn them into little angels.
My work was filling cordite to fire off the whatever into bullets, gun bullets, you know, and that was my job. Cordite was coming through one way and it was cut off in little sections, and there was a chappie at the back all the time seeing that the cordite was run properly through a little hole, and it was very dangerous. He had to fly out one day, it set alight. The cordite did. And we didn't know anything about him. He was round the other side at the back, and he had to be saved from, or else he would have been burnt and killed.
I was on what they called Group 1, and Group 1 was the danger group where we used to fill the detonators and do caps, fill caps. And there used to be powder carriers, girls carrying the powder, and there used to be an opening, and they used to knock, and you used to get your powder through this opening to put in the hopper to fill like your detonator or your cap. And of course, a lot of the accidents happened then because it was the hopper moving over to fill the detonators or the caps underneath. And of course, it would probably just spark, and up it would go.
And there would be trouble.
One thing that World War II produced in abundance was acronyms. Should a British girl join the Wrens or the WAF, the ATS, the AFS, the ATA, the WLA or the WVS? And if you were more of an East End gal than a West End gal, would they have you?
The call is sounded and women fall in for service in their country's cause.
Just as it had in the earlier war, social class played its part in the selection process.
Class was a really important issue at first. It became quite an issue to the extent, though, that when they were recruiting, it seemed very, very difficult to become an officer if you weren't already from a fairly middle-class family. And questions were asked in the House about this, as to whether that was actually the case. In the Wrens, you couldn't even join unless you had a reference from someone who was a retired or serving member of the Royal Navy. So that weeded out most people from the Wrens.
You had to have 3 references to join the Wrens, and because it was small, it tended to fill up its requirements for woman power quite quickly and easily. It also was seen to have the best and most flattering uniform because it was navy blue, and the others were Air Force blue and khaki, and in particular the khaki uniform of the ATS was not seen as particularly fetching. So the implication was that the Wrens recruited a better class of young women than the other two.
The recruitment of women for the various auxiliary services started well before the outbreak of World War II. Some volunteers saw the upcoming hostilities as a chance for excitement and adventure.
A friend of mine came to me and said, it was Munich, you see, and there's going to the Munich crisis, 1938. There was this terrible business with Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler. And so she said, there's going to be trouble. Let's get into it. So she and I and my cousin joined the Fannies. So we joined, and we used to go and do drive ambulances around Richmond Park and in the dark and on exercises and all that sort of thing, learned first aid. Oh, we had a great time. And I used to live in London with my cousin then, and when her parents were away, they used to come back sometimes and go to the same little restaurant, which we used to frequent before our training days. And then we used to go in there and in uniform. And so when my aunt and uncle went in there sometimes to dine, we went around, and the chap used to say, the pretty soldiers have been here in here again.
The Army's Auxiliary Service, the ATS, recruited women from the widest range of social and educational backgrounds. In an echo of the way in which their predecessors, the WACs of the First World War, had been gossiped about, they too experienced their fair share of prejudice.
The ATS was known as the ground sheet of the army, which meant, implied that women were getting off with men. And there were some pregnancies, but the pregnancy rate wasn't as enormous as was implied. There was some increase in venereal disease.
We had to have an FFI, free from infection. If you went on leave, you came back and you had to have an FFI. It was hilarious. We had to gather in a bunch outside the MO's door,
and you were in your pants and bra, stripped right down. And you'd go in, he'd pull your bra and have a look at you. He'd pull your elastic of your knickers in the front and look down, pull them at the back and look down. And some of them would ping the elastic hard. You know, I think they took great fun of it. We always said that when we come to Civvy Street, we could strip in the high streets.
Whatever the snobberies about the auxiliary services, the war couldn't be fought without them. Without the women ferry pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary, for example, the RAF would not have had a steady supply of aircraft from the factories. Not that that saved them from male chauvinism.
I can remember one particular instance where at Lindholm up in Yorkshire, where I'd taken Halifax in, they wouldn't allow women, in, especially in bomber stations, into the mess in those days. And at that instance, they allowed the flight engineer in to give him his lunch. And they said I could have lunch in a cupboard or something. And I said, no, I won't bother, thank you very much. And so I went out to the airfield and waited till the flight engineer had had his lunch.
The war in the sky between the RAF and the Luftwaffe and the harsh realities of aerial bombardment meant that many women came under fire, and some returned it.
The Royal Observer Corps, which underwent a huge expansion just after the Battle of Britain, that expansion was mainly to do with women. And of course the main area women served in was in the ATS and in anti-aircraft command. So they were on searchlights and they also were in mixed batteries on the anti-aircraft guns. Generally the thing that they didn't fire the guns held true, but in reality there were a few remote places where this actually happened. And as one of the heads of the ATS said, it would be ridiculous to be standing there under fire, not being able to fire the gun because you weren't allowed, even though you knew how to do it. So anti-aircraft command was the main area. In fact, the 93rd Searchlight Regiment was an entirely female regiment.
There were lighter moments. In the spirit of "For tomorrow we die," and as a reaction to the privations of war, men and women were determined to enjoy themselves. Dancing was hugely popular, and when American troops arrived on British shores, things really got lively.
What about the Americans?
Oh, what should I say? Lads used to come in and that, and we used to, one time we used to go in a group, all the lasses used to go in a group, but then our lads were very polite. They would come up and say, excuse me, may I have the next dance? And more or less practically bow a little bit, you know. Well, of course, when the Yanks came, and that I was there one time, and one comes up to me and he says, "Come, Snake, let's wriggle." And he shakes himself like this. Well, I didn't know whether to smack him across the face or what. Well, of course, all the rest of the girls were killing themselves laughing, you know. They thought it was a huge joke. And anyway, I got up, but I think I got up intending to do a waltz, but I think it ended up with doing the jitterbug, you know. The legs were out and he was swinging me here and swinging me there.
American troops came over with their own glamour anyway. They arrived when rationing was really biting hard, and they arrived with enormous quantities of chocolate, stockings, things people hadn't seen at all or for years, if ever. One of the particularly fascinating things about the American GIs was, of course, many people in this country, very much a white country at the time, had never seen anyone who was black. So when black American GIs came over, these These men were particularly exotic because they were the first time anyone had seen anyone who was black.
Their place at the controls of our fighter planes.
So alien were they that the US government felt it had to make a film introducing civilians to the idea of the Negro soldier.
Their native land they fly. Tomorrow, what a surprise the Nazis will get when black, brown, yellow, and white men, all Americans, land on the airfields of Berlin and Tokyo.
When black GIs came over with the American forces, they came over under conditions of segregation because segregation was still prevalent in the USA at that time. But while white Americans were welcomed by British women, taken into their families and supported in all sorts of ways, in many parts of Britain, women felt no reason not to give the same welcome and friendship to black GIs. And some of those women were quite amazed and outraged at the level of segregation that the American forces insisted upon.
After the war was over, a male-dominated society tried its best to return the women of Britain and America to where they had been before it had started, into the kitchen, there to run the home and raise the children. And many women were happy to accept this, particularly in America.
There's been a lot of talk in recent historical works that women were all forced out of industry after the men were demobilized. Some women were. Some women wanted to continue to work and were disallowed this, but the vast majority, on the best information we have, really wanted and expected to return to domestic life. Bear in mind that this domestic life after World War II was radically changed for the vast majority of Americans. It was the first time in American history that the majority could aspire to middle-class status. After the war, there was a tremendous wave of prosperity in the 1950s. So women could buy all these new machines that were being made when you went from making sort of tanks to making vacuum cleaners and refrigerators and all the other sorts of machines, washing machines that women hadn't had before. Families could buy automobiles. So women played a central role in the shift from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy based on consumption.
Life in austerity Britain had little of the same appeal. Many necessities continued to be rationed for years, and many women hankered for the freedom and excitement and recognition they had known in the war.
Although people did go back to the home and back to their peacetime jobs, and if they were men after the war, the fact remains that when it came to it, people had surprised themselves and each other and realised they had a lot more independence and knew a lot about the world outside in a way they never expected to.
Above all, the war had fundamentally changed the way women viewed themselves. They knew they had more to offer than the traditional domestic role, and they were determined to make it happen. The rise of feminism in the 60s and 70s also gave them much greater confidence in making their voice heard. Those who were peace campaigners had spoken out loudly against the build-up of arms during the Cold War. At Greenham Common in 1981, a committed group began a prolonged protest against the use of the site as an American airbase for the storage and deployment of cruise missiles.
Well, when I first came down to Greenham on one of the big demonstrations that they did in December '83, and there were thousands and thousands of women ringing the fence, carrying candles, joking and singing songs. And inside it was very stark. There were guys in military uniform with walkie-talkies, dogs, police vans zooming around. And then towards the evening, when it got dark, we all lit candles and we were singing songs. And everybody just ran at the fence and literally rocked it until it fell down. And I was just inspired by this, this sort of vision of these women. Well, I took part, I was 16 at the time and helped pull down the fence of Greenham Common, and I just felt like we could do anything. Nothing could stop us, and I just kept coming back until I ended up living here.
I mean, I remember one bitterly, bitterly cold winter, and we were just a few yards in that direction, and there was some, 19-year-old lad in the snow on sentry duty with a brazier full of coal, trying to light a lump of coal. He had no idea how to set a fire, so we threw him over some kindling so he could set himself afire and not freeze to death. And then later on, the squaddies came around and gave us a bag of coal. And it got even better than that because, of course, there was the fence and then there was loads and loads of barbed wire. And they tried throwing, this is army coal, they tried throwing the bag of coal over the fence to us and it got caught in the fence and they had to drag it back. And then they said, why don't you cut a hole? And we're going, all right then. And so we went and got the bolt cutters, came back and cut a little hole, and these squaddies were passing the coal through. But because they'd already caught it on the barbed wire, when the MOD police came around later, there's this sort of little pile, on the inside of the base, there's this little pile of coal dust, and then there's a little trail of coal lumps, and then there's this hole in the fence, and then there's another little trail of coal through the snow into the bushes. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes we could talk to them. And connect on really strange levels, on the simple practical matter of keeping warm when it's snowing, and that was nice.
For 10 years they camped outside the wire, attempting, with limited success, to prevent missile movements in and out of the base. In 1991, the Cold War at an end, the last missiles left Greenham, and a year later the Americans departed.
I think there were two really important things that happened at Greenham there was lots of important things, but first is that we got rid of cruise missiles, and the authorities always say, oh, yeah, nothing to do with Greenham, but then they would say that, wouldn't they? And the second really important thing was that we realised we could get rid of cruise missiles.
These women may have got rid of cruise missiles from Greenham Common, but there were still wars in the world and women willing to risk their lives in them. In 1982, the artist Linda Kitson was commissioned to travel to the Falklands when the British fought the Argentinians for control of the islands. How did she approach the task?
I am not a person who is actually interested in war, but at that time it seemed to me that it was perhaps one of the greatest things you could do is to actually, I hope this won't sound old-fashioned, but serve your country. I drew everything that happened around me. There were men working on the runway because it was always being bombed, and they had to roll out this extraordinary sort of matting. I drew for too long, didn't look at the thermometer, and my watch was so buried underneath the 5 layers of whatever. You can't actually feel the pencil because you've got such an enormous amount of stuff. Rather like when you've had too many drinks. It isn't until you come up for air you realise you've overdone it.
With the conflict exploding around her and with no certainty of victory, how would the tired and stressed soldiers react to this woman in their midst, a non-combatant doing a non-essential job in a life-threatening situation? Would they treat her like a fellow soldier or leave her to her own devices while they got on with the fighting?
I did fall down and faint. And these clucking men, if I'd been on my own, I'd have fallen down, fainted, and they wouldn't have known anything about it, because everyone was all together. They bundled me off to this hospital, and damn the hypothermia, that was nothing. That was where I remember saying, and bring my wash bag. And the medics were wonderful. They said, you want a wash bag? Come and look in this room. and it was filled literally up to my eyes in dead people's wash bags. By this time I was so admiring and partisan, started off in hostility, turned right around. I had a letter from Ronald Searle, who was a war artist in the last World War and still alive in France, and he said, "Your book gave me the feeling of exactly what it was like to be there." I wanted to be maybe someone who could pass knowledge on.
And pass it on she did. To the mass of videos and stills from the front line were added some more intimate and reflective images. A photo captures a second, while a drawing can capture an hour, a personality, a string of events. In the midst of war, a moment of silent calm.
It was really to show people what it was like to be there, who were 8,000 miles away, and I didn't know how strange it would be. And what is weird, I was the first woman artist, and maybe the last one to be in something so tin pot. By tin pot, don't get me wrong, I mean so ad hoc, ad-libbed, basic, brutal, and savage against climate and a dangerous enemy.
Two decades later, in America, the events of September the 11th, 2001 had a traumatic impact on national attitudes to the country's defence and redefined the home front. Because America had never experienced aerial bombing, it retained a sense of isolation from the direct physical effects of war on home and home life. This has changed.
Americans no longer have the notion that they're simply safe, going to work, going about their business as they please. And we've seen as a result that in many of the opinion polls that have been done, women supported, they didn't oppose, they continue to support the war against terrorism. That is, you're having less of what's sometimes called a gender gap, where you would have more men favoring military action, women less. That's largely disappeared in the wake of September 11th, in part because women have come to realize, or certainly they believe this to be the case, that their own home front is not protected, that they have to worry about their children and biological and chemical attacks and all the rest.
The events of September the 11th may have brought together once again the traditional home front and the front line, but there are still women who consider it worth putting their lives in danger in real conflict hotspots in order to bring the news of events there to the rest of the world. Television journalists such as Orla Guerin.
You have to have nerve. I think you have to be able to deal with risk. You have to be able to accept the fact that things are very unpredictable and can change very, very fast and will be outside your control. But in your heart of hearts, you also know that simply being there is putting yourself at risk, and you have to be able to accept that. It's really a matter of relying on your instinct and the instinct of the people that you're travelling with. And if somebody doesn't feel happy about being in a place, if somebody has a bad feeling, then you go. And there are days when you have that unlucky feeling. And there are days when you wonder, you know, is something going to happen? Because at the end of the day, what you have to be in a position to do is come back alive with the footage and with the story. In the last 10 years, let's say, there are a generation of women like myself who can do the work that we want to do in the way that we want to do it. In the recent Gulf War, for example, in the occupation of Iraq, we had women who were embedded in frontline units. We had women who were reporting very courageously from Baghdad throughout the war. We had women in every part of that conflict. And I think undoubtedly for women of my era, You know, we are here because other women have gone before us and have carved out a path. But I'd like to think that in the next 10 years, this debate would be redundant and they won't be seeing a difference between the male and female reporters who are doing it.
Even for those familiar with it, war is frequently traumatizing, and it is often assumed that it's a source of nightmares long after it's over.
I don't have bad dreams. I occasionally have sleepless nights, quite rarely, and I do have bad memories. I think when you do this work, you see things that you would love to be able to forget and that you never will. But that is the price of doing the job, and you have to be prepared to take that step, and you have to be prepared to witness what it is that you will see. I think the most difficult thing is when friends and colleagues are injured or killed, and that does bring the risks home to you. Then you realise that you are vulnerable, and the fact that you have been able to do this job safely for 6 years or 10 years doesn't mean that you will be safe every single time.
Whether journalists at the front or observers of conflicts living more everyday lives at home, women of the 21st century are no longer prepared to allow politicians to hijack the traditional image of the family group around the hearth and use it to justify war. Wherever they stand, whatever their viewpoint, they now insist on being part of the debate. Throughout history, women have fought, killed, injured and bombed in the line of duty. This programme explores the hidden history of women at war. From the 1st century AD to 15th century France, 18th century Russia and the 2 world wars of the 20th century, we meet the women who've taken up arms, been in the front line, in the thick of battle. The war women, the fighters. Women have played many roles in the conflicts that have shaped the world. As fighter pilots and factory workers, nurses and spies, photographers and journalists, women have often been at the front line of conflict. This is the story of the women who actually experienced battle at the sharp end, the fighters. The earliest celebrated fighters were the Amazons, who were supposed to live in and around what is now modern Turkey. They were reputed to kill male children, burn or cut off their own breasts so that they could shoot arrows more easily, and murder their menfolk once they'd had their pleasure with them. Homer tells us they fought at Troy, others that they invaded Libya, a fearsome crew by any standards.
Amazons are both historical and a myth. The Greeks probably thought that they existed at some time, but then myths grew up surrounding the Amazons, and so it's very difficult to work back to the historical reality. Greeks and Romans were fascinated by Amazons and the idea of Amazons, I think partly for the same reasons that we're fascinated by warrior queens. They're unusual. To the Greeks and Romans, they're unnatural. In their society, the woman's place was in the home. She was the childbearer, that was her main responsibility. And so the idea of women who spend a lot of their lives outside, who are warriors, taking the man's role in society, that's an inversion of the social norms. That's what happens when a society goes wrong, that you start getting women who are taking the male roles.
While recorded history tells us little about the Amazons, one ancient female warrior is ingrained in Western consciousness. Boudicca, or Boudica. Some think that Boadicea, queen of the Iceni, was considered a goddess by her followers, which would explain why she took no prisoners, instead sacrificing captives to appease her fellow gods. Goddess, or just warrior queen, we do know that she led a large-scale revolt against the Roman invaders of Britain in the years 60 and 61 AD.
Boudica was queen of the Iceni tribe, that's modern-day Norfolk. She and her husband, Prasutagus, were allied to the Romans, who at that time were conquering Britain. But when Prasutagus died, Boudica assumed that she would be able to retain her kingdom and maintain an alliance with the Romans. The Romans had other ideas. They intended to incorporate the kingdom as part of the province of Britain. They came in a rather heavy-handed manner. They whipped Boudica, raped her daughters, and as a result of this, Boudica raised a revolt. She had a spectacular victory against a detachment of the Roman army, and she then went on with other tribes who joined the revolt, and together they sacked Colchester, London and St Albans.
Boadicea's palace was probably at Gallows Hill, near Thetford in Norfolk. She'd done well to sack the Roman town of Colchester and defeat the powerful 9th Legion as she marched on London. Here, excavations for the Underground's Jubilee line have produced evidence that her army actually crossed the river, a considerable feat in a running battle. After a further success in St Albans, Boadicea came up against the well-disciplined army of Suetonius, most likely at Mancetter, where Watling Street and the Fosse Way meet. Despite releasing a hair between the armies before the battle, a magical rite which lends credence to the goddess theory, Boadicea was defeated. She either took poison or fell ill and died shortly after the battle.
It's very difficult to define Boudica's leadership because our historical accounts of her revolt are written by Romans. And so we have to try to look through the biases of the Romans. But I think a couple of things that come through are her ability to unite tribes that before the Romans came were fighting amongst themselves. One of the other things that characterised her leadership, I think, was the brutality. She allowed the tribes that she was leading to commit terrible atrocities in the Roman towns that they were sacking. And finally, her leadership in the battle. She's supposed to have given powerful speeches before the battle to get the Britons into a warlike spirit, but ultimately she made a fatal mistake in agreeing to face the Romans in pitched battle.
Boadicea's image as a ruthless warrior queen may resound through history, but she was not the only woman to wage war in ancient times.
That there were a lot of warrior queens that we hear about from Greek and Roman history. Perhaps one of the most famous was Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. She fought alongside Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. Her ship may not have been in the front line, but she was there with her navy. But it's very clear that a significant number of queens in antiquity were able to lead their armies into battle and were accepted by those armies as war leaders.
Once the tribal wars of Roman Europe had been superseded by more settled societies, the role of women in the domestic sphere was reinforced. The Dark Ages tell us little of women in warfare, except a hint that they may have been involved. Why else pass a law in 590 at the Synod of Drumsir in Ireland, prohibiting women from participating in military operations? As Britain emerged from the Dark Ages, tales of Viking rape and pillage in the towns of Britain in the years that followed continued the notion of women as helpless prey to male invaders. They were to be protected by men at all costs. Popular myths and legends of knights defending princesses and rescuing damsels in distress underline the assumption that a woman's proper place was far away from any battlefield.
Order!
Historically, it would be foolish to underestimate how much of male and female identity is bound up with war and war making. And women come to embody a more pacific image modeled on the Holy Mother, the suffering mother, the mother who weeps because her loved ones have been killed. And this is a sort of collective image of women as beautiful souls, as those who are not sullied by violence.
And there was plenty of violence to be sullied by. As the years passed, stories and legends were buttressed by legal restrictions on women. In 1189, the year of Richard the Lionheart's Third Crusade against Saladin, Pope Urban II issued a bull banning women from making the journey to the Middle East. It wasn't entirely successful. Eleanor of Aquitaine was only one of many high-born medieval women who ignored the prohibition and went on a crusade. But the established church was increasingly instrumental in defining what women could and couldn't do in wartime.
Well, the medieval view of women was of women as both producers and reproducers, if you will. But the view certainly was that there were classes of persons who were not to wield military instruments, instruments of death. That included women, and it included priests who had forsworn use of violence. So the church's attitude was one of real objection.
The power of the church to decide who fought and who didn't was to be tested to the limit by one heroine, ironically one whose religious fervour fueled her military exploits. She was a medieval French peasant girl who provided the country with courageous military and moral leadership that reversed the decline of its fortunes during the 100 Years' War. She became known as Joan of Arc.
I'm a fan of Joan of Arc. I like to think she's the greatest military leader, greatest female military leader that the world has ever known. May not say much because there haven't been a lot of leaders, but she really was special. And she was exactly what she said, or she did exactly what she said she would, which is to go in, defeat the English, drive them away from the Loire River area, and essentially turn the tide of the 100 Years' War.
Joan came from Domremy and started hearing voices at the age of 13, telling her to drive the English out of France. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was due to be crowned king at Rheims, but it was held by the English. Joan told him of her mission from God, and realizing her ability to raise morale and inspire troops with her holy mission, he gave her command of an army, with which she raised the English siege at Orleans and defeated them at Patay in 1429, before taking Rheims, where the King of France was duly crowned. She remained popular with her troops despite making daily mass compulsory and banning the army of prostitutes that followed the troops.
Joan can go and talk to the common soldier. She's one of them. She doesn't have the class distinctions that the noble leaders do. And so she's very good in this way. There are other leaders that can do this, but Joan seems to have been able to do it very, very well. And this, combined with her mission from God, means that on a tactical level and on a strategic level, that she actually performs a generalship that few in the Middle Ages could have duplicated.
But once King Charles of France was crowned, he no longer needed Joan, or probably much appreciated her popularity, so he withdrew his financial support. Joan was captured at Compiègne and was accused by the British of refusing to submit to the church. Charges of being unchaste and of heresy had to be dropped, but she was still found guilty and burnt at the stake by the English, an act for which the French have never forgiven them.
She inspired the armies for a year, she inspired them well, and perhaps her death inspired them even more.
Her preparedness to die for a cause while leading an army of men who were prepared to fight and to die, to kill and to be killed, at the time had a powerful mobilizing effect. And one can understand the lingering resonance of that image without much difficulty if you see the fusion of military imagery church imagery, the image of the Virgin Martyr, all of it coming together in this one iconic figure.
When we think of Joan on the battlefield, we always see her dressed as a soldier. It was a pragmatic decision, and one that was to be copied by a number of female combatants in subsequent wars. To come to prominence, Joan of Arc had to behave and dress like a man. Assuming male identity in order to gain acceptance as a combatant was common to the experience of many women in war, but there was great resistance to this apparently unnatural behavior. King Charles I, for example, issued a proclamation banning women in his armies from wearing men's clothing. In 1642, England was plunged into a civil war that pitted father against son, brother against brother, and also, it appeared, sister against sister. However they were dressed, women were drawn inexorably into this savage struggle.
Women served as soldiers in the Civil War. Particularly in Ireland, there are good examples of elite women who served defending their homes. Lady Forbes defended her castle against a siege, as did Lady Dowdall. There are also examples of troops of women who fought with long knives against English forces. These again are Irish women, but fighting in England. Women were used by both sides, both the parliamentary and the royalist forces in the English Civil War. It's interesting, though, that both sides also used them for propaganda purposes. So, for instance, the parliamentary forces would say, Charles must not have much of an army if he has to rely on women leaders or women soldiers or women spies. They also claimed that perhaps the forces that used women were feminized. And so both sides used them, but both sides downplayed their roles as well.
A century later, as Britain sent military men to conquer distant territories, there were numerous instances of soldiers in the British forces turning out not to be good men and true. In a London pub in June 1750, James Gray, a member of the crew of HMS Swallow, calmly announced to the assembled sailors that he was, in fact, a woman called Hannah Snell. She had had a formidable career.
She was left by her husband when she was about 6 months pregnant, and she tried to find him, and her way of doing that was to pass as a man and became James Gray, became a cabin boy. She later found out that her husband had actually been killed for murdering somebody, but she continued to pass as James Gray and clearly enjoyed it. She took great pains to conceal her sex, and whenever any male colleagues doubted her sex, she always outperformed them in their masculinity.
You also have a woman like Christian Davies from the 18th century. Her husband goes missing and she spends the next 12 years going to find him. I mean, what's interesting about these stories often is that you can read between the lines that women give a very sort of plausible and acceptable reason for going off. In other words, they're going to look for a lost husband, or they go off because they're following their lover. But in fact, quite often what they're doing is that they're going off because that's what they want to do, because their choices are very limited.
While women like Hannah Snell and Christian Davis had largely private reasons for serving as soldiers, others were stirred by a patriotic fervour that was to lead to the birth of a nation. The American Revolution brought with it bloodshed and confusion for all its new citizens. In the chaos, with law suspended and society riven by differing allegiances, there was little to prevent women from throwing themselves into the life and death struggle.
There were no policies in place for how women could or could not participate during the Revolutionary War. Obviously, there was no defining central government yet to dictate policies. And even had there been, the former colonists were so independent-minded that they probably wouldn't have paid attention anyway. We aren't really sure how many women fought in the American Revolution. At least 3 are known to us. The most famous is probably Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man, assumed the alias Robert Shirtliff, and served in a Massachusetts regiment. She wasn't discovered to be a man until she was seriously wounded.
Deborah, who was born of Mayflower stock in Plimpton, Massachusetts, grew up on a farm in Middleborough, a foster child among 10 boys. She volunteered as a soldier in 1782, rapidly gaining a reputation for courage and tenacity. She took part in numerous desperate skirmishes against pro-British strongholds near New York. At Tarrytown, her forehead was gashed by a sabre and she was felled by a musket ball. Somehow she managed to fool the doctors, but when she was later laid low by a fever, her identity was revealed. She was honorably discharged in 1783.
After the war, she writes a memoir about her experiences. And one of the ironies that I love is that she goes off and she does a sort of display with her musket, and then she'll give this little lecture, and she begins it by apologizing for being so unwomanly. But when she's writing her diary, she says that she really loves the fact that everyone looks at her and thinks that she's a boy. They mistake her for a boy. And you often get that sense of these women really gaining a great deal of pleasure out of, I guess, fooling people, pulling it off, and being mistaken for something other than who and what they really are.
Uniform makes you blend in with the crowd, with an army, for example. But it also marks you out as different to the vast mass of civilians. I have a sharp memory from the Gulf War of putting on uniform and the feeling that it changed both status and image, and my relationship with the viewers. Without doubt, the outstanding female military leader of the late 18th century was Russia's own Iron Lady, Empress Catherine the Great. She was a formidable person. Having deposed her husband, Peter III, she seized power and held it by sheer force of intellect and personality.
Catherine the Great was an extraordinary woman who rode into St. Petersburg on her horse, as shown in a wonderful painting by Vilnius. And she was very well known for her grasp of military strategy and tactics. She was an incredibly intelligent woman and wanted, I think, to show that she could be thoughtful as well as powerful, and would often be seen running around in Guards Regiment uniforms and armed with pistols and swords, and looking very, very regal and warrior-like.
As Empress, she effectively neutralized Poland by putting another of her lovers on the throne. With the aid of a third, Gregory Potemkin, she wrested the Crimea from the Ottoman Empire and cemented Russia's hold on the northern coast of the Black Sea.
Catherine the Great was extraordinarily effective as a military leader, in part because of her capacity to mobilize the noble men who did the fighting in those days, or who at least called the men to arms who did the fighting. And she did this in a variety of ways, through, again, showering favors on those who did her bidding, and by punishing those who refused. She faced at a couple of points sort of insurrections, and yet she was able to mobilize her own supporters, in part through the clever use of boudoir diplomacy, to come to her side. And this made her, again, an effective war leader, even though, of course, she never pulled a Joan of Arc sort of number and put on a military uniform and went out to actually ride to battle. You don't have to do that to be a tremendously effective war leader, as she demonstrates.
"12 years after Catherine's death of natural causes, at the other end of Europe, a female folk hero who certainly did pull a Joan of Arc number, but probably with the minimum of boudoir diplomacy, was about to establish herself in military folklore. She took part in the Spanish Peninsular War of 1808 that saw the armies of Britain, Spain and Portugal locked in a fight to the death with Napoleon's forces. It was a conflict that escalated quickly into one of the bloodiest wars Europe has seen for both men and women. Napoleon's forces killed thousands of Spaniards, both civilians and soldiers. The Spanish town of Saragossa endured 2 bloody sieges during the early years of the war. The privations and sufferings of its citizens came to epitomize the horrors endured by the whole population during the French occupation. What occurred on the city walls gave not only the besieged townsfolk but also the country a heroic martyr whose courage and sacrifice became a rallying cry. So much the better that the martyr was a woman, Agustina Dominic, known to history as the Maid of Saragossa.
The Maid of Saragossa famously rallied the effete menfolk of Saragossa by running round the ramparts of the city firing cannons and exhorting men to come and stand and fight like men instead of cowering like women. And of course the myth is that because this was a woman who was telling men to fight like men and not cower like women, that she embodied all those heroic masculine qualities of resistance and valour and fortitude.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the arguments between the northern and southern states were making peace increasingly untenable, until in 1861, clashing convictions about slavery finally propelled America into civil war. After 4 years of struggle that saw 10,000 armed engagements and some 380 major battles, peace was signed. By that time, over 620,000 combatants had died, and a significant number of them were women who fought in the front line for both northern and southern sides.
We will never know exactly how many women served as soldiers during the American Civil War because they were pretending to be men. One contemporary estimate was that there were about 400 women in the Union Army alone, and there may have been more, there may have been less. We'll never really know because they tried very, very hard to keep their secret.
Try as they might, they were not always successful, and the press seized upon their stories of what they portrayed as a sort of sexual deceit with enthusiasm.
There's some really wonderful examples of women attempting to be recruited, signing on, and then getting found out because, for example, they try and put their trousers on over their head. Their table manners are too dainty. They don't laugh at the right jokes. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which their feminine behavior sort of leaks through. But one exception is Sarah Emma Edmonds, who was a Canadian woman who had already been living as a man. She'd been working as a Bible salesman in New England, and she winds up in Michigan just at the outbreak of the American Civil War, and she signs on. And strangely enough, she's involved in this terrible accident when a mule falls on top of her. But rather than be found out, because she says that would bring a great deal of shame upon her, she actually leaves and becomes an army deserter. And then after that, she writes what becomes a best-selling book in America about her experiences.
Another combatant, disguised as a man, who wrote her memoirs but got a far worse reception, was Cuban-born Loretta Velasquez. She joined the Confederate Army and fought at the Battle of First Manassas. She was wounded at Shiloh and managed to escape from Fort Donelson before its capitulation to the Union Army.
Most Victorian women, no matter what they did during the war, tended to write of it in very self-effacing ways because that was socially acceptable. Velázquez, on the other hand, bragged about her exploits, took particular glee in writing about battle and how many soldiers she knows she killed. She answered to no one and made no apologies for any of the things she did. She wrote very frankly about her multiple marriages. In a time when the heroines of adventure novels were always very chaste and virtuous, Velázquez was not, and she never pretended to be. And that was at the root of why later historians were so dismissive of her, is her refusal to even pretend to be a proper Victorian lady.
Any lingering remnants of the Victorian lady notion of womanhood were shattered by the conflict that tore Europe apart in the early 20th century. If women in general didn't find it any easier to become accepted as combatants, there were individuals who now had the confidence to press the issue. During the First World War, Flora Sands was one of the first to put her head literally above the parapet. Sands was an English clergyman's daughter who went off to serve with the Red Cross and ended up fighting in the Serbian army.
She fought through every single campaign with the Serbian army, and I think that that's why the men had such huge respect for her. And it's extraordinary to see these photographs of Flora literally in a foxhole with her tin hat with everyone else. And you know, it's so extraordinary and so wonderful really that this woman who's 40 and has been a secretary all her life and probably had not that much to do with men, quite happily takes on this completely different identity and really becomes one of the men, really identified with them.
Flora left Charing Cross for Serbia on the 14th of August 1914, ostensibly for a 3-month stint as a nurse. In southern Macedonia in the summer of 1915, she could have retreated with the Red Cross to Albania, but she chose to join the Serbian army as a private. By the 15th of November, she was in the thick of it, but still managing to uphold standards. Called at 9 o'clock, saw a dead Austrian, had tea 400 yards from the Austrian lines, drove back under fire, had lunch and dinner with Mr. Kafala and the Prince. By 1917, Flora is clearly getting stuck in. She wrote on the 13th of May, "Trenches all night. Went on patrol with Dodich in no man's land. We got down as near as we could to the Bulgar trenches, 4 of us, and sent over a few rifle bombs. They sent up Veery lights, but we lay low till it was dark again and then crawled back. It's good sport." Her diaries indicate that despite her situation, she remained a very English lady. They're packed with what-hos and good sports and tales of jolly adjutants. However, it's clear that Flora Sands was at the heart of the action and was accepted as a soldier by all of those around her.
There's one point where she's recuperating. She's got a bit of R&R that's due her, and she goes into what turns out to be a brothel with a group of men. It's a kind of cafe, and this woman comes and sits on her lap and doesn't realize that she's a woman and starts making comments about, oh, this lovely young man. And she kind of laughs it off, but it's very interesting that, you know, she has to kind of play along. You know, she doesn't tell this woman who she really is.
This is Flora Sands' gun, and she used it when she was fighting in Serbia from 1915 onwards. There was a very bitter conflict on that front, and she joined the Serbian army in an attempt to work with them to halt the German advance. And she was promoted to Sergeant Major, which is an incredible feat for a woman, particularly in a foreign army. You can see that it's very well worn. She kept it by her throughout her time in Serbia. obviously to protect herself and also to fight against the enemy. It's one of those things that is a very sort of personal item that she obviously felt very comfortable having at her side.
Having risen to the rank of Sergeant Major, Flora Sands was also awarded the Karađorđe Star in 1916, the first woman in Serbia ever to receive this honour. She worked tirelessly to raise consciousness of the country's cause and was depicted in the British press as a kind of Serbian Joan of Arc. She married one of her fellow officers, Yuri, but later, as with many soldiers, she found it difficult to adjust to civilian life. She died in England and her memorial is at Malsford in Suffolk. The Great War also saw another extraordinary chapter in the story of women on the battlefield. Maria Boczkaryova, the third daughter born into a peasant family from Tomsk in Siberia. She persuaded the new Soviet War Minister, Alexander Kerensky, to let her form an all-women battalion. They styled themselves the Battalion of Death. Her speech to the new battalion reveals something of the fierce pride, the determination and patriotism that Boczkaryova hoped to bring to bear against Russia's German enemy.
Идите с нами утереть слезы и заживить раны России. Укройте ее своими жизнями. Мы, женщины, превращаемся в тигриц, чтобы защитить наших детей от позорного ярма, защитить свободу нашей страны.
Well, when Maria Boczkaryova canvasses women from all across Russia, she ends up with a group of 2,000. And what she does is she puts them through a pretty rigorous training. And I think that what happened was that there were a lot of women who showed up wearing sort of lots of jewelry and lots of makeup and thinking this might be a good idea, but actually just couldn't make the grade in terms of their training. So what you end up with is this small group of 300 who do indeed go off to fight, and apparently they were mixed with a group of men, so that there was partly a male regiment that was with them, and there would be a man, a woman, a man, a woman. But in fact it ended up there were actually more men than women fighting with them.
Useful as they were as a propaganda tool for the newly formed Soviet government, the battalion actually suffered heavy losses. Not everyone agreed that women should be fighting in the front line. Florence Farnborough, an English nurse working in Russia and an acute observer of the war, wrote of their exploits.
Some remained in the trenches, fainting and hysterical. Others ran or crawled back to the rear. Boczkaryova retreated with her decimated battalion. She was wrathful, heartbroken, but she had learned a great truth. Women were quite unfit to be soldiers.
Unfit or not, while further west thousands were dying in the trenches of Passchendaele and Ypres, the Battalion of Death had lived up to its name. Of the 300 who fought, 100 were either killed or severely wounded. After the Russian Revolution in October 1917, the party promoted the idea that men and women were equal, aiming to overturn centuries of tradition and convention. In the democracies of the West, this was paralleled by the struggle for women's suffrage. This further sharpened opinions on the role of women in warfare. What had previously been a religious or cultural question was now a prominent political issue. The division came to a head in the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. Early resistance to General Franco's military coup came from the trade unions and workers' organizations, who were the first to mobilize. Without the prescriptive control of a national government, women joined the ranks and went to the front line as combatants.
The image of women fighting at the front from the Spanish Civil War, and they do go wearing overalls, dressed just like the militiamen, they carry rifles, they hang off armoured cars and so on, has a very negative effect outside Spain. There is a real fear of Soviet communism, and this image of armed women fighting for a left-wing cause seems to reinforce that. And that is one of the reasons why the Popular Front government sends women back from the front in September 1936. The Francoist side, which though is not overtly fascist, has got a strong fascist component, and there is a fascist party. They always prize themselves on the fact that, as they put it, their women never wore trousers and certainly never carried guns.
But the Francoist side had no hesitation in adopting a woman, the Maid of Saragossa, who had helped to raise the siege 100 years earlier, as a symbol of tradition, strength and sacrifice.
She is a heroine during the Spanish Civil War, but only to one side, which is in fact the Francoist side, who make a great play of the Maid of Saragossa, because even though she fires the cannon and she exhorts the men to come back and stand their positions, she only does it in desperation. She only does it as an emergency response to an emergency situation, which is the Francoist view of women's mobilisation. It's an emergency response to an emergency situation, and they should exhort men to behave like men, while they should, once that moment has passed, return to the home and provide the kind of support and succour that women are put on this earth to provide.
And sure enough, when Franco triumphed, he lost no time, aided and abetted by the Catholic Church, in reducing women to the status of dependents. Their plight, though, was soon forgotten in the titanic struggle against fascism in the rest of Europe. Country after country fell to Hitler's Wehrmacht, and the British Expeditionary Force retreated back across the Channel from Dunkirk. While the RAF fought the Luftwaffe for control of the sky, civilians were forced to face the terrors of the Blitz. In her darkest hour, how did Britain mobilise her female population?
The range of roles women fulfilled in World War II was absolutely enormous. Initially the idea was it'll be clerical, driving and domestic duties, and very much away from the front lines. They wouldn't be under fire, and they certainly wouldn't bear arms either.
If British women were to be kept well away from the front, elsewhere there were fewer limits to their participation. When Hitler's ill-fated Barbarossa campaign in Russia brought with it unimaginable devastation, suffering and death, Soviet women played their full part in repelling the German invaders, as soldiers and as pilots. There were, for example, some 2,000 women snipers operating throughout Russia, but of that number, only 500 survived the war. The best known of these was Ludmila Pavlichenko, a 24-year-old history student who shot and killed 309 German soldiers as the bitter fighting raged in this most savage of campaigns. She survived the siege of Odessa and visited London in 1942 to support the British women's war effort. But in a country that's queasy about the idea of women combatants, what do you give a woman sniper as a gift? A shiny new pistol, obviously, but also a sterling silver teapot.
I mean, the Soviet women made an incredibly important contribution militarily during the Second World War. I mean, if you think about the 588th Air Regiment, which was composed entirely of women and had 4,000 members, they flew something like 24,000 missions. There were hundreds of sorties every night, and these women were up in the air taking their life in their hands. And so I think that, they really set a very important precedent in the Soviet Union. I think that they really proved that obviously women could do these kinds of jobs. But I think that just in terms of, being a woman sitting in a cinema somewhere and seeing those images of those women either acting as snipers or women flying planes or women being medics, I think that really must have given women some idea of being able to identify themselves in a different way, that those kinds of occupations and those kind of activities would be open to them. I think that really does mark a kind of shift and something which is very, very different from what's going on in the West at the time.
From Berlin, from Rome,
From Tokyo, the campaign started. Propaganda to confuse, divide, soften up their intended victims.
The Nazi view of women was encapsulated in the phrase Kinder, Kirche, Küche, children, church and kitchen. Their principal value to the Third Reich was as breeders of the master race that would inherit the world.
They brought together large groups of young men and young girls for human breeding. Of course, the children from this assembly line belong to the state to be scientifically trained for conquest.
For all its idealized public view of national womanhood, Nazi Germany had little hesitation in putting them into uniform in some specific jobs to play their dreadful part in the horrors of Hitler's final solution.
Women played a role in the death camps in a variety of ways. Some women were commandants or assistant commandants of these camps, actually helped to run the camps, the machinery of death.
There were 65,000 prisoners at Belsen. 28,000 women and children were still alive when the Allies arrived. Most of the guards were unable to get away. Kramer, the camp commander, is today condemned and will pay for his crime along with his accomplices, men and women. For there were women among them, women even more debased and cruel than the men.
And there are, of course, some horrific stories from those who survived the camps of the brutality of some of the women inside the camps, including the brutality of women who were in the so-called hospital wing or the commissaries who would treat injured or ill prisoners with extraordinary brutality. And women were the nurses who often injected lethal doses of various medications into the arms of children to kill them off because a child had cerebral palsy or a child had epilepsy. So you have women playing, in a way, in the uniform, literally the uniform of the woman as the giver of life and the woman as the nurturer of life, killing children because they're mentally retarded or because they're physically disabled.
If the Second World War reminded us that women in uniform can act with cruelty and brutality equal to men, it also taught us, if we were in any doubt, that they are also capable of extraordinary courage and heroism. Now, in the 21st century, women play a more active role in the armed forces and conflicts around the world. And crucially, a world media reports their activities, be they suicide bombers or American privates. So, does this mean that women have gained acceptance? Nikki Smith, who serves in Cyprus, is the first woman to command an RAF helicopter squadron. It's what she's always wanted to do, and for her, gender is not an issue.
Whenever things do get a little bit more tense, the professionalism just kicks in and you do what you've been trained to do. So the only time you think about it really is in the bar afterwards. When people go into a conflict situation, they don't really have much opportunity to think about how they feel. They just have to get on and do the job as they've been trained to do it. I have met some American USAF female pilots. The Americans are about 10 to 15 years ahead of us in terms of opening up opportunities for women in the military. And really they've got far more female pilots than we have and a female aircrew. So I think it's a good predictor for the future for the UK military. That said, we've had females in the Air Force now for in flying jobs for well over 10 years, and we're really getting quite used to it. And increasingly we'll see more women filling the many roles that are now available to us.
A recent Ministry of Defence report examined the role of women in the military. As well as addressing the question of strength and physical ability, it looked at the thorny problem of the effect of women on their male comrades in arms.
Women have a particular impact on unit cohesion, it is feared, because, for example, of relationships forming between women and men within units, and also because it is feared that men are more likely to abandon their mission and to try and protect an injured woman than they would be if it were a male comrade. So the MOD report brings up these issues. It also concludes, however, that it is impossible to ascribe any characteristic to an individual on the basis of their gender, which is an interesting conclusion in that it contradicts another point made in the report, which is that there is still more research needed on whether there are any psychological reasons for why women are unsuited for combat. So one of the issues it raises is that women are less aggressive than men, and that it takes them longer to be prepared to be aggressive. And what isn't clear in the research is how to divide nature and nurture, and of course you can't.
On those very few occasions when I've seen men fighting mad, they were soldiers and they'd reached a pitch of aggression which I found completely alien, something I'd never experienced as a woman. Whatever the future is to be for women in the military, no one, though, can deny that for centuries women have fought in some of the most crucial conflicts in our history. They may have been forced by prejudice and convention to fight for their right to do so, but that's an achievement in itself, and they're here to stay.